Hi guys. Tonight we step into a place where your breath turns white the instant it leaves your mouth, where the mountains loom like dark shoulders against a star-heavy sky, and where cold is not just weather, but a constant presence pressing against your ribs. You stand in the Rocky Mountains at dusk, boots crunching on frozen ground, the air sharp enough to sting your nose. Somewhere far off a creek murmurs under a skin of ice, and the smell of pine sap hangs faintly in the air. This is not a postcard winter. This is the kind of cold that quietly asks a question every night: are you prepared enough to see morning? You probably will not survive this if you wander in with modern confidence and none of the old knowledge. That is the cheeky reality check, and the mountain men learned it fast or not at all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you are listening from somewhere warm or somewhere already dark, go ahead and post your location and local time. It is always comforting to know where everyone is drifting off from. Now dim the lights and you let yourself step fully into this world. You're alone now, or mostly alone, wrapped in layers that smell faintly of smoke, sweat and animal hide. The sun slips behind the jagged ridge, and with it goes the last mercy of warmth. Night in the Rockies arrives quickly, almost impatiently. One moment you can still see the contours of distant peaks. The next you're surrounded by blue shadow and creeping cold. This is where survival becomes less about strength and more about decisions made hours earlier. Mountain men, the fur trappers and traders of the early 19th century, faced this moment again and again. A simple historical fact often surprises people here. Many of these men spent months, even years, without returning to any settlement at all, roaming thousands of miles through mountains most Americans at the time could barely imagine. That meant night after night like this, with no cabins waiting, no guaranteed firewood stacked neatly by a door. Just you, the land, and what you carried or could make. As darkness settles, sound changes. The wind sighs through spruce branches, snow shifts softly under its own weight, and every crack of ice sounds louder than it should. Your senses sharpen because they have to. You listen not just for animals, but for changes in weather. A sudden stillness can mean the temperature is about to plunge. Old trappers knew this pattern well, though historians still argue whether some of their weather lore came from indigenous teaching or was learned the hard way through bitter experience. You pause to rub your hands together, the leather of your gloves stiffening as the temperature drops. There's a faint smell of tallow from your gear mixed with damp wool. The cold creeps in at the seams, at the cuffs, at the place where your collar meets your neck. This is the moment when panic could set in, but it rarely helped. Instead, mountain men learned to move with intention, calmly, even slowly conserving energy, as daylight vanished. There is a strange intimacy to this kind of cold. It presses close, forces awareness of every toe, every finger. You shift your weight, feeling the frozen ground through layers of hide and wool. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howls, the sound long and hollow. It is not always a threat. Sometimes it's just company, a reminder that other creatures are also negotiating the night. A quirky tidbit often slips into these stories, almost unbelievable, until you picture it. Some mountain men were known to sleep sitting upright against a tree, believing that lying flat on frozen ground pulled heat from the body faster. Whether this was always effective is debated, but it shows how improvisation ruled their lives. Comfort was a luxury they rarely chased. Survival was enough. You begin to understand that the coldest nights were not always the ones with the lowest temperatures. Damp cold with melting snow or icy rain could be far more dangerous. The Rockies could deliver both sometimes in the same night. The air smells wetter then heavier, and your clothing clings instead of insulating. This awareness settles into you now, early in the night, as you assess the sky, the wind, the slope of the land. As stars emerge sharp and countless, you feel both very small and oddly grounded. The mountains have a way of shrinking worries down to essentials. Are you sheltered from the wind? Do you have fire? Are you dry? These questions repeat in your mind like a quiet chant. Modern life rarely demands this kind of clarity, which may be why imagining it feels strangely calming, even as the danger remains real. You think about how many men stood where you stand now 200 years ago, squinting into the same darkness. Some were chasing beaver pelts worth small fortunes back east. Others were running from debts, from wars, from past lives they wanted to leave behind. The cold did not care about their reasons. It treated everyone the same. There's a scholarly debate that still hums beneath these narratives, though it rarely makes it into popular retellings. Historians still argue whether mountain men were as solitary as legend suggests, or if survival in such cold depended more heavily on informal networks and seasonal gatherings. As you stand here listening to the wind, it feels easy to believe both. Nights were often spent alone, but knowledge was shared. Stories passed, techniques borrowed and refined. Your fingers tingle, not painfully yet, just enough to remind you time matters. Night is settling in fully, now wrapping the land in quiet. This first cold evening is not about mastery. It is about orientation, learning the rhythm of the mountains, accepting that warmth must be earned, protected and respected. You take one last slow breath, filling your lungs with air so cold it feels clean, almost metallic. The sky arches above you, immense and indifferent. Somewhere ahead there will be fire shelter routines and tricks learned through hardship. For now, you simply stand at the edge of night, aware that surviving the coldest hours in the Rockies begins not with bravado, but with attention. You ease deeper into the night by thinking about who these mountain men actually were, because understanding the people helps calm the fear of the place. You picture them not as legends yet, but as ordinary men shaped by very unordinary choices. Most were young, many barely past their 20s, and a surprising number could not read or write well. A simple historical fact grounds this image. The peak years of the Rocky Mountain fur trade ran roughly from 1820 to 1840, a short window when beaver hats drove men into some of the harshest terrain on the continent. You imagine standing beside them, sharing the same cold air, noticing how varied they were. Some were American-born, others French-Canadian, some Mexican, some British, and quite a few were immigrants who barely spoke English. Accents mixed around campfires, and so did habits. This was not a single culture, but a rough blend held together by shared risk. The cold flattened differences quickly. It did not matter where you came from when your fingers went numb. Their reasons for being here were rarely romantic at first. You sensed that as clearly as the chill on your cheeks. Many were chasing money that was hard to earn anywhere else. Beaver pelts could fetch high prices in eastern cities and Europe, and for a time the demand seemed endless. Others were running from something. Debt, failed farms, broken families, even the law. The mountains offered distance and anonymity, but they charged for it nightly and cold. You notice how reputation mattered among these men. Around fires, stories circulated fast. Someone who could not handle winter nights earned a quiet label and was not trusted on long trips. Someone who knew how to stay warm became valuable beyond his trapping skill. Historians still argue whether reputation systems like this were informal survival tools or just social habits transplanted from frontier life. But out here they clearly shaped who lived longer. There is a faint smell of smoke drifting in your imagination, now mixed with unwashed wool and animal fat. Mountain men did not bathe often in winter, partly because water froze quickly, and partly because stripping layers was dangerous. This created a shared sensory world. You would recognize another trapper by smell before sight sometimes. It sounds unpleasant to modern ears, but it also meant familiarity, a strange comfort when human contact was rare. A quirky tidbit surfaces here, one that often surprises listeners. Some mountain men adopted new names for themselves, while in the mountains nicknames earned through events or accidents. Names like Broken Hand or Old Bear were common. This was more than bravado. It marked a break from former lives. When you renamed yourself, you were less tied to whatever you left behind and perhaps more willing to endure nights like this. You shift your stance, imagining the weight of their gear. These men travelled light by necessity. Every extra pound meant more sweat, and sweat in winter was dangerous. Clothing froze stiff. Bodies cooled fast, so they stripped life down to essentials mentally as well as physically. This mindset becomes clearer as you think about them now. Comfort was not expected, endurance was. The social history matters here because mountain men were not always alone. Despite the lone wolf image, they often travelled in loose groups or met at seasonal gatherings called rendezvous. These events were famous for trade and celebration, but they also served another purpose: knowledge exchange. Techniques for surviving cold nights spread through jokes, boasting, and quiet demonstrations. Someone would notice how another man wrapped his feet or positioned his fire, and that observation might save a life months later. There is ongoing scholarly disagreement about how much indigenous influence shaped mountain man culture. Historians still debate whether trappers would have survived without Native American guidance, or whether they would have adapted independently over time. Standing here in the imagined cold, it feels difficult to separate the two. Knowledge flowed where survival demanded it. Pride softened quickly when frostbite threatened. You sense the psychological shift that came with adopting this life. Time changed shape. Days were measured by light and weather nights by how long the fire held. Calendars mattered less than seasons. This made men both resilient and fragile. Resilient because they adapted to constant uncertainty. Fragile because isolation and cold worked quietly on the mind. Some men simply disappeared, leaving no record beyond rumours. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked adds weight to this. Many mountain men did not die in dramatic ways. They survived winters, adapted to cold, and eventually drifted into other roles as guides, scouts, or settlers. The image of universal violent death is exaggerated. The cold was a filter, not always an executioner. Those who learned it stayed. You imagine their faces in firelight. Beards rimed with frost eyes, squinting against smoke and wind. Laughter sometimes cracked the silence sharp and sudden. Humour mattered. Gentle sarcasm even then helped men face nights that stretched endlessly. Jokes about frozen boots or snoring companions kept fear from settling too deeply. The mountains around you remain silent as these thoughts pass. Stars seem closer, now brighter. You feel how these men belong to a transitional moment in history. Soon railroads and towns would tame parts of this land, making such isolation rarer. But for now, in this mental space, you share their uncertainty. You're learning who they were not as heroes or villains, but as humans, negotiating cold with stubborn creativity. The understanding settles in slowly, like embers glowing rather than flaring. Mountain men were not superhuman. They were adaptable, observant, and willing to borrow wisdom wherever it appeared. That combination, more than muscle or myth, carried them through the coldest nights. As the darkness deepens, you feel closer to them, less as distant figures and more as companions whose choices still echo in the quiet. You move forward into the first true test of night, the moment when cold stops being theoretical and becomes physical. This is the reality check mountain men remembered long after daylight returned. The first night out was often the hardest, not because it was colder than others, but because your body and mind were still adjusting. You feel that now as you imagine settling in muscles, stiff, breath shallow, every sound amplified. The sun is long gone. Darkness here is not total, but it is thick, layered with shadow. Snow reflects starlight just enough to outline trees and rocks. You notice how your fingers ache as blood pulls inward the body, choosing core warmth over comfort. This decision happens without asking you. Mountain men learned to respect it. Fighting the body wasted energy. A straightforward historical fact anchors this moment. Many trappers entered the Rockies, for the first time in late summer or early fall, unprepared for how quickly temperatures could plunge at higher elevations. Early journals describe nights that froze water solid even before winter officially arrived. That first unexpected freeze taught lessons no guidebook could. You shift closer to where your fire will be even before it is built. The idea of warmth becomes magnetic, but there is a catch. Fire takes time, effort, and fuel, all of which are harder to manage in the dark. You imagine the clumsy frustration of striking sparks with numb fingers, the smell of sulfur. The soft curse breathed into cold air. This is where panic might creep in if you let it. There is a curious, almost fringe detail shared in some trapper accounts. A few men claimed they could sense dangerous cold in their bones before it arrived, describing a deep ache or pressure in joints. Modern science might chalk this up to barometric pressure changes, but historians still argue whether these sensations truly helped men prepare, or if they were simply remembered that way after survival. The first night teaches humility. You realize how small mistakes stack up. You sat too long during the day and sweated. Now your shirt is damp. That dampness turns icy against your skin as soon as you stop moving. Mountain men learn to avoid sweating in winter, a concept that feels backward to modern thinking. Today we exercise to stay warm. Here overexertion could quietly kill you. Sound plays tricks on you. The crack of a tree adjusting to cold echoes like a gunshot. Snow slides off a branch with a whisper that makes your heart jump. These reactions are normal. Mountain men wrote about restless first night's minds, racing bodies refusing to fully relax. Sleep came later after routines were established and confidence grew. You picture yourself laying out gear with deliberate care. Everything has a place even in the dark. A knife where it can be reached with gloves on. Fire steel dry and ready. Extra socks tucked close to the body so they stay warm. This organisation mattered more on the first night than any other. Forgetting where something was could mean exposing skin too long to retrieve it. A mainstream fact that surprises many listeners fits here. Some mountain men purposely stayed awake much of the first night, believing it was safer to monitor the fire and weather, rather than risk deep sleep before everything was secure. This was not insomnia. It was strategy. Exhaustion could wait. Survival could not. The cold seeps upward from the ground. You feel it through layers, a steady drain rather than a sharp bite. This is when the mind starts bargaining. Just a few more minutes before building shelter. Just a little rest. Mountain men learn to distrust these thoughts. The first night rewarded action, not comfort. There is debate among scholars about how often men truly faced life-threatening cold on these initial nights. Historians still argue whether dramatic stories were amplified later to impress listeners back east. But even if some tales grew taller with retelling, the physical reality remains. A single misjudged night could end a trapping season or a life. You smell smoke now, faint but comforting as kindling catches. The fire is small at first, carefully fed. Too big wastes wood and draws attention. Too small risks dying out. Balance becomes everything. The flames crackle softly, and you feel heat on your shins while your back remains cold. This uneven warmth defines early nights. Your body begins to learn. Muscles loosen slightly near the fire. Breathing slows. Fear recedes enough to think clearly. You realize that surviving the cold is not about conquering it, but about working with it, using its patterns, respecting its limits. The first night does something else quietly. It strips away illusions. You no longer imagine yourself as an invincible traveller. You're a guest here, tolerated only as long as you behave correctly. This realization is sobering, but also calming. Expectations adjust. You stop demanding comfort and start planning for continuity. As hours pass, the stars shift. You feed the fire again, smaller pieces now. Movements are economical, practiced even on this first attempt. The cold remains, but it feels less hostile, more like a constant companion watching for mistakes. You begin to understand why mountain men remembered these first nights so clearly. They were initiation, the beginning of a long conversation with winter that would continue until spring, or until one side gave up. You begin to understand that clothing is not fashion here. It is architecture. Every layer is a wall between you and the cold, and mountain men treated these layers with the seriousness of shelter. You imagine pulling garments tighter as night deepens, feeling how each piece traps warmth or fails to. The smell of cured hide and wood smoke clings to you earthy and reassuring in a rough way. Period journals make it clear that trappers abandoned European-style clothing quickly. Linen shirts and tailored coats simply did not hold up. Instead, buckskin became the standard. Deer and elk hides softened through long hours of scraping and smoking, formed shirts, leggings, and coats. Buckskin breathed better than woven cloth, allowing moisture to escape rather than freeze against the skin. This detail mattered more than warmth alone. You run your hands over imagined seams. Buckskin feels supple, almost alive even in the cold. Wool appears underneath, in some cases often traded or scavenged. Wool retained heat when damp an advantage no one argued with. Cotton, by contrast, was avoided when possible. It trapped moisture and stole heat, a mistake learned painfully by newcomers. There is a lesser-known detail tucked into some accounts that feels almost intimate. Many mountain men preferred clothing that was already worn and softened rather than new. Stiff new hides cracked more easily in cold weather. Older garments moved with the body and reduced chafing. Comfort here was not luxury. It was efficiency, conserving energy by avoiding injury. The influence of indigenous dress cannot be missed. You imagine copying the cut of leggings that tie at the waist, the use of fringe that help shed water, and the practice of layering hides strategically. Some trappers openly acknowledge learning these methods from native teachers. Others absorb them quietly. Interpretations continue to differ on how much was imitation versus independent adaptation, but the result was clothing suited perfectly to the land. You feel the weight of these layers now. They're heavier than modern synthetics, but they breathe, flex, and protect. Each piece smells faintly of smoke from repeated curing, a scent that also repels insects when seasons change. Clothing served multiple roles at once, something mountain men valued deeply. Gloves or mitts were often an afterthought at first, and then a revelation. Hands froze fast, and mittens made from fur retained heat better than fingered gloves. Losing dexterity was a trade many accepted. Warm hands mattered more than precise movement. You imagine clumsier motions by firelight compensated by patience. There is disagreement among researchers about how often mountain men layered excessively. Some accounts describe men wearing minimal clothing while active, adding layers only when stopping. Others suggest heavier constant layering. Both could be true, shaped by personal tolerance and experience. What mattered was adjusting constantly, never letting sweat accumulate. You notice how clothing also affected sound. Buckskin moved quietly, an advantage not just for hunting but for nighttime peace. Cloth rustled less in wind. This subtle silence contributed to calm. Loud fabric could startle you awake or alert animals nearby. Even sleep depended on what you wore. Repairs were constant. Seams split hides, tore wool thinned. You picture sitting by the fire needle clutched awkwardly in thick gloves, mending by feel more than sight. A torn garment in winter was an emergency, not an inconvenience. Clothing maintenance became a nightly ritual, almost meditative. You sense how these layers created identity too. A man's clothing told stories. Stains, patches, and stitching marked seasons survived. Newcomers stood out in ill-suited outfits. Veterans blended into the landscape colours, muted shapes familiar. As the cold deepens, you pull layers closer, grateful for each decision made earlier in the day. Clothing does not defeat the night. It negotiates with it, holding warmth close while allowing movement. This balance, learned slowly and often painfully, became second nature to those who stayed. The fire crackles softly. Smoke curls upward, catching on fur and leather. You feel protected, not invincible. but prepared. Clothing in this world is not something you wear. It is something you rely on like a quiet companion that stands between you and the dark until morning. You shift your attention downward because in cold like this survival often begins at your feet. Mountain men learned quickly that frozen toes could end a season or a life just as surely as hunger. You imagine stepping through snow crust that squeaks, faintly, feeling how each step sends cold upward through soles and bones. The ground steals heat patiently, never rushing. Accounts from the period frequently mention footwear as a constant problem. Heavy leather boots common back east stiffened in deep cold and trapped moisture. Many trapper abandoned them in favour of moccasins made from soft hide. This choice surprises modern listeners, but it made sense. Moccasins dried faster, moved with the foot, and allowed better circulation, which mattered more than insulation alone. You feel the difference immediately in your imagination. Moccasins hug the foot closely. They're quiet on snow and forgiving on uneven ground. But they come with responsibility. Without thick soles, you must read the terrain carefully, avoiding sharp ice and hidden stones. Footwear does not replace awareness, it demands it. A curious habit shows up in several first-hand descriptions. Some mountain men carried extra pairs of moccasins and changed them frequently throughout the day, hanging damp pairs near the fire at night. Wet footwear was treated like an enemy. Even slightly damp hide could freeze solid overnight. Dry feet meant warm blood flow, and warm blood meant sensation. Socks varied widely. Wool was prized when available, often worn in multiple thin layers rather than one thick one. Some men stuffed grass moss or even shredded bark between sock and moccasin for added insulation. It sounds crude, but plant fibers trapped air and absorbed moisture. Whether this practice was truly effective is still contested by experts, but many men swore by it. You imagine loosening your footwear near the fire, careful not to expose bare skin too long. Steam rises faintly from damp wool. The smell is strong, earthy, and familiar. Feet are rubbed, flexed, inspected by touch more than sight. Loss of feeling is noted with concern. Pain is often a good sign, numbness is not. Frostbite crept in quietly. Toes turned pale, then waxy. Early intervention mattered. Some men massaged feet gently or pressed them against a companion's body for warmth. The exact best treatment was not universally agreed upon. Interpretations differed, and advice varied wildly, sometimes dangerously so. One odd detail emerges from campfire stories. A few trappers claimed sleeping with moccasins on helped prevent freezing. Others insisted removing them reduced moisture buildup. Both approaches appear in records suggesting adaptation based on conditions rather than rigid rules. Footwear also shaped travel choices. Snow depth, crust hardness, and slope influenced routes. Mountain men often avoided long night travel in winter because feet tired faster and injuries multiplied. This practical caution contrasts with later romantic images of endless wandering. You feel gratitude for every step that remains warm. The fire crackles, casting light on your feet, still alive with sensation. You understand now why experienced trappers obsessed over footwear. It was not glamorous, but it was decisive. As the night stretches on your toes, flex slowly inside softened hide. The cold presses from below, but for now it is held at bay. Feet planted firmly, you are still standing still, moving still. Part of the long negotiation between body and winter. You settle beside the fire because everything in the night begins and ends here. Fire is not comfort in the modern sense. It is orientation. It tells you where you are, how long you have before sleep, and whether morning is likely. Mountain men treated fire almost like a living thing, something to be fed, watched, and respected. You feel its uneven warmth on your shins while your back remains cold, a familiar imbalance. Sparks rise and vanish into the dark. The smell of resin and charred wood mixes with leather and smoke. This scent becomes the signature of winter nights. Even weeks later, men could recall it instantly, a reminder that they had endured. Records from the era show that experienced trappers chose firewood carefully. Resin-rich pine and spruce burned hot but fast. Hardwoods lasted longer, but were harder to find at high elevations. Men learned to combine them, starting fires with quick-burning wood, then settling into slower fuel once flames were steady. This was not guesswork. It was practice skill. You imagine crouching low, shielding the flame from wind with your body feeling heat lick at your gloves. Fire-starting tools were guarded obsessively. A lost flint or damp tinder could mean a deadly night. Some men carried fire in insulated containers while travelling embers wrapped in bark or fungus. This practice appears often enough in accounts to suggest it was common, though opinions differ on how reliable it truly was. One strange habit appears in several journals. A few mountain men reportedly slept with their feet pointed toward the fire and their heads uphill, believing this reduced smoke inhalation and helped circulation. Whether this positioning had measurable benefits remains uncertain, but it reflects how much thought went into every detail. Firelight changes perception. Shadows stretch and shrink. The forest feels closer, more intimate. Sounds soften. You notice how watching flames becomes hypnotic. This mattered psychologically. Fire calmed nerves, slowed racing thoughts, and offered something steady in a world of constant uncertainty. Experts disagree about how large winter fires typically were. Some descriptions suggest roaring blazes visible for miles. Others describe small controlled flames, barely enough to warm hands. Both likely existed, shaped by location, fuel availability, and the need for secrecy. Large fires wasted wood and attracted attention. Small fires demanded vigilance. You feed the fire, carefully mindful not to let it die. Each movement is slow, deliberate. Gloves off too long could stiffen fingers. Gloves on made handling wood clumsy. You balance these risks instinctively as mountain men learn to do through repetition. Fire also dried gear. Moccasins were propped carefully, never too close. Shirts and leggings steamed gently. Too much heat shrank hide and ruined clothing. Too little left dampness to freeze. This constant adjustment filled hours of the night, especially during early winter when moisture was hardest to manage. You imagine the quiet conversations that happened here, stories murmured, advice exchanged. Sometimes silence stretched long, punctuated only by crackling wood. Fire made companionship possible without demanding it. You could sit together without speaking, sharing warmth and presence. There is a long-running discussion among historians about how often fires were kept burning all night. Some believe men slept in shifts tending flames. Others argue fires were allowed to die once shelter was secure. The truth likely varied. Weather fatigue and fuel decided more than doctrine. The fire becomes your clock. As it burns down, you add smaller pieces. As embers glow, you consider sleep. You learn to read flame colour, listening to the pitch of crackles, to judge wood quality. This literacy of fire came only with time. You feel a subtle fear when the fire dips too low. Darkness presses closer. The cold seems to creep faster. Fire does not just produce heat. It holds back the night psychologically. Losing it feels like losing ground. One overlooked detail appears in a few personal accounts. Some men sang quietly to themselves while tending fires. Simple tunes, repetitive, barely audible. This was not entertainment. It kept rhythm, kept alertness, kept fear from slipping in. Music like fire anchored the mind. As hours pass, your eyes grow heavy. The fire settles into a steady glow. You arrange wood within easy reach, planning for half-awake feeding. Sleep near a fire is never deep. It is layered, alert, responsive. Mountain men learn to rest without surrendering awareness. You lean closer, feeling warmth seep inward, easing muscles tight from cold. The fire becomes less dramatic, now more reliable. It has done its job. You trust it, but not fully. Trust here is always conditional. Above you stars wheel slowly. Below you embers pulse like breathing. Between them you exist in a narrow band of warmth and vigilance. Fire holds that space fragile and powerful at once. As the night continues, you realize that surviving cold nights was never about a single trick. It was about relationships, with clothing, with land, with fire. This flickering presence beside you is the most intimate of those relationships, and like all of them, it demands care in return. You stay close to the fire, but now your focus shifts from flame to what remains after it settles. This is where the night often turns dangerous. The coldest hours usually come just before dawn, when exhaustion is deepest and attention fades. Mountain men learned that a fire burning brightly at dusk meant nothing if it vanished at 3 a.m. What mattered were the coals. You crouch low, poking gently at the embers, watching how they glow red beneath a skin of ash. There is a faint metallic smell here mixed with old smoke. This quiet heat feels different from flame. It is slower, steadier, and more patient. You realize that surviving the night depends on knowing how to stretch this warmth without feeding it too fast. Old trapper journals describe a technique often repeated across regions. Before sleeping, men banked their fires, pulling coals together and covering them lightly with ash and earth. This slowed oxygen flow and preserved heat for hours. It was a simple act, but one learned through trial. Too much cover smothered the fire entirely. Too little left it burning too quickly. You imagine shaping the firebed carefully, hands moving with practiced confidence. Wood is arranged not for brightness, but for longevity. Thick pieces are laid close, thin ones set aside for later. The fire is no longer entertainment, it is insurance. There is an odd practice mentioned in a few scattered accounts that always raises eyebrows. Some mountain men reportedly urinated on the outer edge of their firebed before sleeping. The moisture slowed burning and added insulation once frozen. Whether this actually worked consistently is unclear, and opinions differ sharply, but it shows how little pride mattered when warmth was at stake. You listen to the night again. Wind brushes the treetops, snow shifts faintly. The world feels held in suspension. This is the hour when mistakes compound. Let the fire die, and restarting it in deep cold becomes much harder. Let it flare too high, and you risk burning through precious fuel before morning. The ground beneath you radiates cold upward. You sense how banking coals also creates psychological comfort. Knowing warmth waits just under the ash allows your body to relax slightly. Muscles unclench. Breathing slows. Sleep becomes possible, though never deep. Some written accounts suggest men slept in short intervals, waking instinctively to check embers. Others describe men waking only when cold crept too close. Memory varies, and no single pattern dominates the records. What remains consistent is vigilance. Even in rest, awareness never vanished entirely. You pull your blanket closer, feeling its weight press warmth inward. The blanket smells faintly of animal fat and smoke, familiar and grounding. You keep boots near the fire, not too close, just enough to stay flexible. Frozen footwear in the morning could delay travel dangerously. A detail often overlooked appears here. Many mountain men positioned a long piece of wood partly in the fire, extending outward. As the inner end burned, the log could be nudged forward without standing up fully. This simple trick reduced exposure and conserved energy during half-awake moments. The cold deepens quietly. Stars sharpen overhead. Your eyelashes feel stiff. You resist the urge to curl too tightly, knowing circulation matters. The firebed glows faintly now, not bright enough to light the camp, but enough to promise renewal. There is disagreement among modern interpreters about how reliable these methods truly were in extreme cold. Some argue that below certain temperatures banked fires offered limited benefit. Others point to repeated success across decades of trapping. The truth likely depended on wood-type weather and experience. You rest one eye open, then both closed. Time stretches oddly here. Minutes blur into long pauses. When you wake again, the cold has crept closer, nudging you awake rather than shocking you. You reach out, stirring ash gently. Red glimmers answer back. Relief settles quietly. A few thin sticks are added. Flame returns slowly, obediently. You feel warmth spread again, gradual and controlled. This cycle repeats through the night. Wake, feed, settle. It becomes a rhythm almost soothing in its repetition. The fire no longer feels fragile. It feels managed. This sense of control is small but powerful. In a world where weather terrain and animals ignore your wishes, maintaining a coal bed becomes a rare victory. As dawn approaches, the fire brightens once more. The cold does not vanish, but it loosens its grip slightly. You stretch stiff limbs, feeling pins and needles in fingers and toes. The worst has passed. You realize now that banking coals is not just about heat. It is about continuity. Carrying warmth from one moment to the next, refusing to let the night fully reset your progress. Mountain men survived not by fighting the cold head-on, but by outlasting it quietly ember by ember. You move away from the fire just enough to notice how exposed you still are. Heat fades quickly once you step back, and the night reminds you that flame alone is never enough. Shelter is the next negotiation. Not a house, not even a tent in the modern sense, but something fast, practical, and shaped by what the land offers right now. You scan the ground the way mountain men learned to do instinctively. Wind direction matters first. Cold air slides downhill like water pooling in low spots. You avoid those without thinking. A slight rise the leeward side of a stand of trees, the curve of a rock face. These details decide whether the night presses gently or aggressively. Descriptions left by trappers show how quickly shelters were built. Lean-tos made from poles and brush were common angled sharply to shed wind. The open side faced the fire, turning heat into a shared resource. You imagine snapping dead branches with a muted crack, the smell of sap sharp in the cold. Snow crunches underfoot loud in the stillness. There is a quiet satisfaction in building something with numb hands. Each branch placed correctly steals a little power from the night. You work steadily, not rushing, knowing clumsy speed waste energy. The shelter takes shape slowly, uneven, but functional. It does not need to be beautiful, it needs to block wind. One overlooked practice shows up in a handful of winter accounts. Some men stacked snow against the outside of brush shelters once they were built. Snow counterintuitively insulated well. Packed carefully, it sealed gaps and trapped warmer air inside. This method depended on dry snow. Wet snow collapsed and soaked everything. Success relied on reading conditions accurately. You crawl inside the finished space, feeling the temperature difference immediately. The wind hushes, sounds soften. Your breath echoes faintly off branches above you. The shelter smells of crushed needles and cold earth. It is not warm, but it is calmer, and calm preserves energy. Experts disagree on how often mountain men used more elaborate shelters like snow caves. Some descriptions suggest they were rare, reserved for emergencies or deep winter travel. Others hint that experienced trappers used them more than we assume. The records are thin, shaped by memory and selective storytelling. What is clear is that simplicity ruled. Time and energy were precious. You imagine laying a robe or blanket along the back wall, creating another layer between you and frozen ground. The shelter works in partnership with bedding and fire. Alone, each is insufficient. Together they create a survivable pocket. The sounds outside change again. Wind slides over the shelter rather than through it. A branch taps lightly, then settles. You feel hidden, not invisible, but less exposed. This matters psychologically as much as physically. The sense of enclosure allows your body to release tension bit by bit. Some men favoured rock over wood, tucking into shallow overhangs or behind large boulders. Stone blocked wind effectively but held cold. You picture leaning against icy rock, grateful for protection, but wary of heat loss. The choice always involved trade-offs. There was no perfect shelter, only better or worse options. You notice how shelters were rarely permanent. Mountain men did not invest days into construction unless forced. Mobility mattered. Shelters were tools, not homes. This mindset prevented attachment. If weather worsened, you moved. If food ran thin, you moved. Staying put too long created risk. A strange but telling habit appears in some stories. A few trappers slept with their heads covered loosely by spare hides, leaving a small gap for breath. This trapped warmth and reduced frost forming on hair and beards. It also risked dampness. Whether it helped or harmed depended on airflow. Experience made the difference. Inside your shelter, the firelight flickers across rough walls. Shadows sway gently. You feel the warmth reflect inward, faint but noticeable. This is how simple structures multiplied heat rather than creating it. Position mattered, angle mattered, inches mattered. There is lingering debate among researchers about how often shelters failed catastrophically. Tales of collapse and suffocation exist, but they are rare in primary sources. More common are quiet mentions of discomfort drafts and long nights. Failure was usually gradual, giving time to adapt if you stayed alert. You lie back carefully testing space. Your shoulders brush branches. Your knees bend slightly. It is cramped, but that reduces air volume, making warmth easier to hold. You pull your blanket close the fabric, rough against your face. Outside, the cold remains absolute. Inside it is moderated, softened. The shelter does not defeat winter. It shapes it into something manageable. This distinction mattered deeply. Expecting comfort led to disappointment. Expecting protection led to gratitude. As hours pass, you adjust position subtly. A branch shifts, snow settles. You listen for changes, trusting your senses to wake you if something feels wrong. Shelter demands attention even as it allows rest. You realize that these simple structures carried an entire philosophy. Do not overbuild. Do not underestimate. Use what is near. Adapt constantly. Mountain men survived cold nights not by creating barriers, but by creating buffers, thin margins that kept the worst at bay. Your shelter creaks softly in the wind. Firelight pulses. Your breath slows. Wrapped in branches hide and intention, you remain present through the night, not fighting the cold but coexisting with it until dawn returns. You settle into what passes for rest, and almost immediately you realize that sleep here is nothing like sleep at home. The ground beneath you is the quiet thief. Even with shelter overhead and fire nearby, the frozen earth pulls warmth steadily from your body. Mountain men learned early that the night did not need wind or snow to be dangerous. The ground alone could do the job. You shift slightly, testing your bedding. Spruce boughs crackle softly as you move. Their sharp, clean scent rises up, mixing with smoke and cold air. This layer matters more than it looks like it should. Accounts written by trappers often mention cutting armloads of evergreen branches before nightfall, laying them thickly to create space between body and soil. Air trapped between needles slowed heat loss. You imagine the difference immediately. Without insulation beneath you, cold creeps into hips and shoulders within minutes. With it, the chill becomes tolerable, still present but dulled. The body relaxes just enough to rest. This lesson was learned fast and remembered forever. Men who forgot it rarely forgot twice. There is a small but telling detail tucked into several winter descriptions. Some trappers preferred to sleep slightly reclined rather than flat-propping shoulders with packs or rolled robes. This reduced contact with the ground and eased breathing in cold air. Whether this truly preserved more heat is uncertain, but many found it more comfortable, and comfort here was not trivial. You lie still, now aware of every point of contact. Cold seeps in where bedding thins. You adjust instinctively, pulling material closer, tucking edges under your body. These small movements happen half asleep. Mountain men learn to listen to discomfort rather than ignore it. Pain was information. Sleep comes in fragments. You drift, then surface again. The fire crackles. A distant animal moves through snow. Wind brushes the shelter lightly. Your mind does not fully shut down. This state feels strange at first, but it becomes normal. Rest without surrender. Some modern writers assume mountain men slept poorly and constantly suffered from exhaustion. Yet diaries suggest something more nuanced. Men adapted to this broken sleep and functioned well within it. The human body, it seems, can learn to rest in layers when required. There is disagreement among historians about how often men truly slept through entire nights in winter. Some accounts claim it happened rarely. Others describe long stretches of uninterrupted rest once routines were established. As with much in this world, experience likely shaped outcomes more than the rules. You feel your breath frosting the air inside the shelter. Moisture gathers on hair and beard, then stiffens. This can be uncomfortable, but is also familiar. Many trappers brushed frost away gently upon waking, careful not to break hair. It was a minor ritual part of greeting the morning. A peculiar habit appears in a few scattered stories. Some men tucked warm stones from the fire into bedding near their feet. Wrapped carefully to avoid burns, these stones released heat slowly through the night. This method worked briefly and required caution. Stones cooled faster than expected, and reheating them meant more exposure. Still, in certain conditions, it made the difference between numb and tolerable. You curl slightly, then stop yourself. Curling too tightly restricts circulation. You extend legs just enough, keeping blood flowing. These adjustments become instinctive with time. The body learns winter as a language. The smell of earth is strong here. Frozen soil has its own scent, metallic and faintly sweet. It seeps upward, reminding you how close you are to the land. There is no separation. Bedding is not a mattress. It is a negotiation. As hours pass, you wake briefly to feed the fire, then settle again. Each time it takes less effort to fall back into shallow sleep. Fear has loosened its grip. Familiarity replaces it. The night no longer feels like an enemy waiting to strike, but a presence that demands respect. Some accounts suggest men talked quietly to themselves while lying awake, reciting plans for morning or replaying memories. This occupied the mind without stirring the body. Others preferred silence, letting thoughts drift. There was no single method. Survival allowed for individuality. You notice how dawn announces itself subtly. The cold shifts slightly. The darkest hour passes. The fire needs feeding less urgently. Your body senses change before your eyes do. Sleep deepens just before morning, paradoxically, when danger is easing. You stretch carefully, joints stiff but responsive. The ground has not won tonight. Bedding, shelter, fire, and constant adjustment have held it at bay. This victory is quiet, easily overlooked, but deeply earned. You realize now that sleeping without sleep was not suffering in the way stories often suggest. It was adaptation, a different rhythm shaped by necessity. Mountain men did not wait for comfort to rest. They rested within discomfort, using awareness as insulation. As pale light creeps through branches, you open your eyes fully. Frost sparkles faintly, your breath steadies. You've passed another night not by shutting down, but by staying present enough to listen, adjust, and endure. You wake with a low, steady hunger that feels different from ordinary appetite. It sits deeper, closer to the spine, and it does not ask politely. In cold like this, food is not about pleasure or even fullness. It is fuel, and without it, warmth slips away no matter how good your shelter is. Mountain men understood this instinctively, sometimes better than they understood the cold itself. You reach for what you have set aside, hands moving slowly to conserve heat. The smell of fat hits first heavy and faintly sweet. Period writings mention again and again how much these men depended on dense foods in winter. Lean meat alone was not enough. Without fat bodies burn through calories too fast, leaving men weak and chilled even beside a fire. You chew deliberately. Dried meat takes effort jaw muscles working steadily. Pemmican appears often in winter accounts, a mixture of dried meat pounded fine and mixed with rendered fat. It was compact, long-lasting, and remarkably effective at keeping the body warm. Traders learned quickly that this food mattered more than almost anything else they carried. There is a small detail tucked into several descriptions that feels oddly human. Some men warmed their food slightly by holding it near the fire rather than cooking it fully. Hot meals were rare at night because cooking took time, light, and attention. Warmed fat melted just enough to be swallowed easily, delivering heat from the inside out. You feel the effect slowly. Warmth spreads not outward but inward. Fingers tingle. Toes feel more present. Eating in the cold creates a delayed reward, one that arrives quietly but reliably. Mountain men learned to eat before sleep, even when tired, because going to bed hungry invited shivering that never quite stopped. Trade ledgers and letters suggest that winter rations were carefully planned. Men carried more fat than protein when possible, despite the weight. This choice was not obvious at first. Many newcomers suffered until they learned it. The land taught this lesson firmly. Some accounts mention unusual additions to winter diets. Melted tallow stirred into coffee. Bits of marrow sucked directly from cracked bones. Even small quantities made a difference. These practices sound stark now, but they reflect an intimate understanding of the body's needs. Not everyone agreed on timing. Some men preferred to eat heavily before settling in for the night. Others ate lightly but frequently waking to chew small amounts when the cold crept close. Written recollections vary, suggesting adaptation rather than rule. What mattered was listening to the body and responding before weakness set in. You sip melted snow, carefully mindful not to chill yourself. Drinking cold water without food could drop core temperature. Men learned to balance thirst and warmth, sometimes choosing mild dehydration over dangerous cooling. These decisions sound harsh, but they were calculated. The fire flickers as you finish eating. Grease shines faintly on your fingers. You wipe them on leather, saving nothing. Waste is not tolerated here. Every calorie counts. There is a quiet satisfaction in eating under these conditions. It feels earned. The food tastes simple, almost blunt, but it carries reassurance. You know you have given your body something to work with through the long hours ahead. As you settle back into your bedding, the hunger fades into a low hum of energy. Muscles loosen slightly. Shivering slows. This is how food becomes shelter, how calories turn into insulation no blanket can replace. You understand now why winter survival depended so heavily on diet. Fire, clothing and shelter could only do so much. Without enough fuel, the body became another failing structure. The night deepens, but you're steadier now. The cold remains patient and present, but it presses less sharply. You rest aware that warmth sometimes comes not from what surrounds you, but from what you carry inside. You feel hunger linger even after eating, not sharp anymore, but watchful. In winter, it never fully leaves. It waits. Mountain men learned to recognize the difference between ordinary hunger and the kind that warned of trouble. This deeper emptiness came with fatigue, slower thinking, and a chill that fire could not quite chase away. Winter journals often describe long stretches when food ran thin despite careful planning. Traplines failed. Animals moved on. Snow buried snares. Men who thrived in autumn sometimes struggled by January. The Rockies did not offer guarantees. Even experienced trappers faced lean weeks that tested both body and judgment. You imagine chewing slowly, rationing without quite admitting it to yourself. Portions shrink. Meals stretch farther apart. Each bite becomes more deliberate. Fat is guarded closely. Protein alone does not satisfy anymore. Without enough grease strength drains faster than expected. This reality caught many men off guard during their first hard winter. Some accounts hint at an uncomfortable truth. Starvation did not always arrive dramatically. It crept in quietly. Weight dropped, endurance faded. Men slept more but felt less rested. Cold felt sharper, more personal. This gradual decline was dangerous because it dulled urgency. By the time hunger felt desperate, options were limited. There is an unusual detail that appears in a few recollections. Some trappers claimed that talking about food made hunger worse, so they avoided describing meals aloud during lean times. Others did the opposite, telling elaborate stories about feasts as a distraction. Both responses appear in different accounts, showing how the mind searched for ways to cope when the body struggled. Not everyone agreed on how much suffering was inevitable. Some later writers suggested starvation stories were exaggerated to heighten drama. Others pointed out that surviving records tend to favour those who lived, not those who quietly failed. The truth likely sits somewhere between, shaped by selective memory and lost voices. You feel how hunger affects warmth. Fingers grow clumsy. Toes ache more quickly. Shivering starts sooner and stops later. Fire still helps, but its comfort feels thinner. Mountain men learned that hunger and cold reinforced each other, each making the other harder to endure. During severe shortages, men sometimes took risks they would normally avoid. Travelling farther in bad weather, hunting at night, splitting up when staying together was safer. Hunger narrowed choices. It pushed action when patience might have been wiser. Many winter accidents trace back to this pressure. Some trappers describe stretching rations by boiling bones, repeatedly extracting every trace of grease. The broth was thin but warming. Others chewed rawhide from old gear, softening it in water. These measures were not common daily practice, but they appear often enough in accounts to show how far men would go when necessary. You imagine the taste, bland, tough, unpleasant, yet eaten slowly with care. The body does not judge flavour when survival is at stake. It accepts what it can get. There is disagreement among modern interpreters about how often hunger truly became life-threatening. Some argue that skilled trappers usually avoided the worst outcomes. Others note that winters varied wildly, and skill could be overwhelmed by weather and chance. The Rockies were not consistent. One mild season could be followed by brutal scarcity. You notice how hunger changes time perception. Hours stretch longer, nights feel endless, thinking drifts. Mountain men fought this by clinging to routine, checking traps even when returns were low, maintaining gear, feeding the fire carefully. Structure helped keep despair at bay. A subtle psychological effect emerges in several winter narratives. Men reported dreaming vividly about food during starvation periods. Smells and textures lingered upon waking, sometimes sharper than reality. These dreams could comfort or torment. Waking to an empty pot after a feast dream carried its own sting. Despite this, many survived. They adapted, endured, and learned where lean seasons hit hardest. Experience taught them when to retreat, when to seek rendezvous early, when to follow rivers or lower ground where game moved more reliably. You sit quietly now, aware of how much modern comfort insulates you from this reality. Hunger today is usually temporary solvable, with a short walk or a delivery app. Here hunger was information. It signaled danger long before collapse. As the night deepens, you pull your blanket closer, conserving heat. The fire glows steadily. You're fed enough for now. That knowledge brings calm. The cold does not vanish, but it eases its grip. Mountain men did not romanticize hunger. They respected it, feared it, and planned around it. Survival depended on recognizing its early signs and responding before strength faded beyond recovery. You breathe slowly, feeling the warmth you have earned settle deeper. Another night stretches ahead, but you're still steady. Hunger waits quietly in the background, not defeated but held at bay. For now, that is enough. You begin to notice how much of what keeps you alive tonight did not originate with the mountain men themselves. The knowledge feels older, layered, carried across generations before ever reaching these camps. As the fire settles and the wind softens, you sense that survival here was rarely invented from scratch. It was learned, borrowed, and adapted. Many winter techniques entered trapper life through close contact with indigenous communities. Early travelers wrote about observing native hunters move through snow with confidence that felt almost effortless. Clothing cut for movement. Camps placed where wind slipped past instead of biting. Fires built low and purposeful. These observations changed how newcomers approached the cold, whether they acknowledged it openly or not. You imagine listening quietly, watching rather than asking. Instruction was not always formal. Sometimes it came through example. A man noticed how another positioned bedding or layered hides. He copied it the next night. That quiet exchange saved energy and sometimes lives. Trade records and personal letters show that items like snowshoes, moccasins, and certain food preparations entered trapper camps through these relationships. Snowshoes in particular reshaped winter travel. Without them, deep snow turned every step into exhausting labour. With them, movement became smoother, almost gliding. This tool alone changed how far men could range during winter. There is a small but striking practice mentioned in a few accounts. Some trappers learned to smear exposed skin lightly with animal fat before long cold travel. This reduced wind burn and slowed moisture loss. The smell was strong, but protection mattered more than comfort. Whether this technique was universally effective remains unclear, but many men repeated it. You feel a quiet respect settle in. These techniques were not abstract ideas. They were responses to this exact land shaped by centuries of observation. Adopting them required humility. Pride faded quickly when fingers went numb. Not all borrowing was perfect. Some methods were misunderstood or poorly applied. Accounts conflict on how well trappers grasped deeper principles versus copying surface actions. The difference mattered. Using snowshoes without understanding terrain still led to danger. Wearing moccasins without managing moisture caused frostbite. Knowledge had context, and stripping it of that context carried risk. You notice how trust played a role. Relationships between trappers and indigenous groups varied widely. Some were cooperative, built on trade and mutual aid. Others were tense or hostile. Survival knowledge flowed most easily where trust existed. This uneven exchange shaped who survived winters more consistently. A detail often overlooked appears here. Some trappers adopted seasonal movement patterns similar to local tribes, shifting camps to lower elevations during the harshest months. This reduced exposure and improved access to game. Others ignored this advice, staying high out of stubbornness or habit. Outcomes differed sharply. The fire crackles softly as you think about this layered knowledge. It feels less like a single tradition and more like a braided one. Techniques intertwined, changed and evolved with each winter. There is no single agreement among modern writers about how much credit was given at the time. Some journals acknowledge teachers by name, others remain vague or silent. Silence does not erase influence, but it complicates the record. What remains clear is that many trappers who survived long winters did so by listening more than they spoke. You feel gratitude now, even if imagined. Gratitude for knowledge passed quietly, often without ceremony. Survival rarely announces its sources. It simply works when applied correctly. As the night stretches on, you adjust your position unconsciously using methods learned indirectly through this chain of experience. Bedding placed thicker beneath you. Shelter angled just so. Fire kept modest and steady. These choices feel natural now, as if you discovered them yourself, but they carry history. Mountain men often became carriers of this knowledge, in turn passing it along to newcomers or settlers. The chain continued, altered, diluted, but present. Survival information moved like a current through time, adapting to new hands. You rest easier knowing you are not alone in this effort, even across centuries. The cold remains serious, but it no longer feels mysterious. It has been studied, tested, and negotiated long before you arrived. As your breath steadies and the fire glows low, you understand that enduring winter nights in the Rockies was never about isolation alone. It was about connection, to land, to people, to lessons learned the hard way and shared quietly. Wrapped in borrowed wisdom and present awareness, you remain warm enough. That is how it has always worked here, not through dominance but through listening. You step back into the snow with care because hunting in winter changes everything you think you know about sound and movement. The world feels wrapped in felt. Each footstep lands softer than expected, yet every breath sounds loud in your own ears. Mountain men learned quickly that winter did not just hide animals, it also hid mistakes. You pause, often letting silence return. Snow absorbs noise, but it also amplifies sudden movement. A careless shift sends a sharp crunch across a frozen crust. You feel how patience becomes a kind of warmth, slowing your body, keeping sweat from forming. Moving too fast here costs more than it saves. Accounts from cold seasons describe how game behavior shifted with snow depth and temperature. Elk and deer favored lower elevations and south-facing slopes, where wind scoured ground clear. Rivers and willow bottoms became lifelines. Men who ignored these patterns wasted energy. Those who watched closely found food when others did not. You imagine scanning tree lines, eyes adjusting to subtle contrast. A flank against bark, steam rising faintly from nostrils. Winter hunting demanded stillness more than strength. Hours might pass without movement. Muscles stiffen. Cold creeps in. You balance staying alert with conserving heat, a quiet tension that never fully resolves. One detail that surfaces in several winter recollections is how men modified their breathing while stalking. Slow inhales through the nose, long exhales downward away from targets. Breath carried scent, and in cold air it travelled far. Animals knew it. Hunters learned to work around it. Firearms behaved differently in winter too. Powder clumped. Metal stung bare skin. Rifles were kept under blankets or inside clothing to protect them from frost. Shots were not taken lightly. A miss meant wasted energy and noise that cleared the area for hours. Success brought relief mixed with urgency because processing an animal in cold carried its own risks. You feel the tension spike as an animal falls. There is no celebration yet. Work begins immediately. Fingers numb quickly. Knives bite slower. Blood steams briefly, then darkens. Men moved fast, but carefully aware that standing still too long invited chill deep into the bones. Some winter hunters stripped hides, only partially carrying quarters back to camp before finishing work. Others processed on the spot despite the cold. Memory varies, shaped by weather, daylight, and distance. What remains consistent is urgency. Meat left unattended froze solid or drew predators. You notice how sound returns as you work. Snow crunches, breathing quickens. The quiet hunt gives way to practical noise. This transition mattered. Animals fled. The landscape shifted back to stillness once you moved on. A practice mentioned quietly in some journals involves rubbing snow on hands and faces after handling warm meat. It sounds counterintuitive, but the sudden cooling reduced swelling and slowed numbness later. Whether this helped consistently is unclear, but many men repeated it enough to suggest some benefit. Carrying meat in winter was its own test. Weight pulled at shoulders, sweat threatened. Men adjusted loads, carefully stopping often to cool down without chilling. Balance mattered. A fall risked injury far from help. You move slowly now, feeling the rhythm of effort, and pause. The cold becomes background, not gone, but less demanding. Purpose focuses attention. Hunting gave structure to winter days and nights, something to lean on when isolation pressed hard. There were nights when hunts failed entirely. Snowstorms erased tracks. Animals vanished. Those nights felt longer. Fire burned lower. Hunger spoke louder. But when hunting succeeded even modestly, morale lifted noticeably. Food was reassurance made tangible. You reach camp again, breath steadying. The fire welcomes you back with familiar scent. Meat is hung where cold preserves it without freezing too hard. Each step follows a pattern learned through repetition. This routine protects energy and reduces mistakes. Winter hunting also shaped social behavior. Men shared information about animal movement quietly, selectively. Trust mattered. False information could doom someone weeks later. True information created bonds stronger than words. As night settles again, you feel how the hunt lingers in your body. Muscles ache, but the ache is purposeful. Fat will render. Meals will come. The cold feels less sharp when you know tomorrow holds sustenance. You settle beside the fire, listening to snow whisper as it falls again. The land returns to stillness. Hunting in winter didn't conquer this silence. It worked within it, borrowing moments of movement before yielding back. You realize that surviving cold nights depended as much on daytime restraint as nighttime preparation. Moving wisely, watching closely, accepting when to stop. These habits carried men through seasons when strength alone failed. As embers glow and darkness deepens, you feel steadier. The hunt has done its quiet work. The cold remains, but it no longer feels empty. There is purpose now, warmth waiting in the hours ahead, and enough calm to rest again beneath the stars. You reach for the small container tucked away in your gear, not out of desperation but curiosity. Alcohol has a reputation out here, wrapped in half-truths and tall stories. The idea that a swallow of whiskey can warm you feels almost comforting, especially when the cold presses in so steadily. Mountain men believed many things about drink, and some of them were dangerously persuasive. You lift the container, feeling its weight light but promising. The smell hits first sharp and familiar, cutting through smoke and cold. Men carried alcohol for trade, for celebration, and sometimes for courage. Winter nights tempted its use more than any other season. The burn in the throat felt like heat, immediate and convincing. Period letters and trading records mention alcohol frequently, but not always kindly. Some trappers warned against drinking in deep cold, noting how men who relied on it often suffered worse by morning. Others swore by a small amount before sleep, claiming it relaxed muscles and eased restlessness. Experience varied, and so did outcomes. You take a cautious sip in your imagination, feeling warmth spread across your chest. It is pleasant, brief, and misleading. Alcohol dilates blood vessels near the skin, creating the sensation of warmth, while actually allowing heat to escape faster. The cold outside does not change, but your awareness of it dulls. This is where trouble begins. You picture the fire glowing, your body relaxing, too much movement slowing. In this state, it is easy to forget to feed embers or adjust bedding. Men who drank heavily often woke colder than before, sometimes confused, sometimes shivering uncontrollably. The warmth was borrowed and came due with interest. Still, alcohol was not banned from winter camps. It had its place. A sip to calm nerves after a hard day. A shared drink to mark survival of another night. Used sparingly, it lifted spirits without overwhelming judgment. The line between use and misuse was thin and cold. Nights made it thinner. There is a curious contradiction in the stories passed down. Some trappers claimed they slept better with a small drink, while others insisted it ruined rest. Both accounts appear credible, shaped by tolerance, body size, and habit. No single rule applied to everyone, which made advice unreliable. You imagine sitting quietly weighing the choice. The fire crackles, the cold remains. You decide restraint matters more than comfort here. Many experienced men reach the same conclusion, especially after witnessing consequences firsthand. Alcohol also affected decision-making beyond warmth. Men under its influence misjudged weather, distance, and fatigue. A short walk felt manageable. A storm seemed less threatening. These miscalculations did not always end well. Winter punished overconfidence harshly. Yet alcohol persisted because it offered something else: connection, shared laughter, memory. In isolation, these mattered deeply. A small drink around the fire loosened tongues and brought stories forward. Songs emerged. The night felt less empty. Some accounts describe men diluting alcohol with hot water or mixing it with fat to slow absorption. Whether this helped is uncertain, but the intention is telling. Men were experimenting, trying to make pleasure safer, rather than abandoning it entirely. You feel how easy it would be to lean into the illusion. The cold asks so much. It would be tempting to take shortcuts. Mountain men learned often painfully that shortcuts rarely paid off in winter. The container goes back into your pack, not gone just set aside. This choice feels mature rather than restrictive. Survival here is about judgment, not denial. There is lingering uncertainty in the historical record about how widespread heavy drinking truly was during winter travel. Some narratives emphasize wild excess. Others describe long stretches of sobriety broken only at rendezvous. Reality likely shifted with circumstance. Isolation limited supply as much as discipline did. You notice how the night deepens again, stars steady overhead. Without alcohol dulling your senses, you remain alert to changes in wind and fire. This awareness feels like its own warmth, a steady presence rather than a fleeting glow. As you settle back into bedding, muscles relax naturally. Breath slows. The cold does not vanish, but it stays predictable. You feel grounded, present. Alcohol remains part of the story, but not the solution. It offered comfort in moderation and danger in excess. Like many tools out here, its value depended entirely on how it was used. You drift toward rest, the fire glowing steadily. The choice you made lingers quietly, reinforcing a pattern you are learning night by night. Survival is rarely about bold moves. It is about small decisions made consistently. The cold listens patiently. It always does. Tonight you have given it no easy openings. You notice the quiet first, not as silence exactly, but as absence. No voices, no distant engines, no soft hum of other lives nearby. The Rockies at night hold a kind of emptiness that presses inward, especially when the fire burns low and the work of staying warm pauses for a moment. This is when loneliness arrives, unannounced but persistent. Mountain men faced this more often than they admitted. Letters written months or years later hint at it in sideways phrases, mentions of missing familiar voices, casual references to talking aloud just to hear sound. Winter nights stretched long, and without conversation thoughts grew louder. You feel that now, lying still aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. The cold sharpens this feeling. Discomfort keeps you alert, but it also isolates. When fingers ache and toes tingle, attention turns inward. There is little room for distraction. Modern comforts that soften solitude are absent. No music unless you make it. No stories unless you remember them. The mind becomes both companion and threat. Some men handled this better than others. Those who enjoyed their own thoughts often fared better through long winters. Others struggled, growing restless or irritable. Journals describe men pacing camp at night, checking traps too often, or waking repeatedly without clear reason. These behaviors were not weakness. They were responses to prolonged isolation under stress. You imagine speaking softly to yourself, narrating small tasks. Feed the fire, adjust the blanket, check the wind. This self-talk appears often in winter accounts. It anchored attention and reduced anxiety. Sound, even self-generated, reminded men they still existed within the vast quiet. A subtle habit emerges in several recollections. Some trappers named objects around them. Their rifle, their knife, their horse. Naming created familiarity, almost companionship. It sounds strange now, but in solitude attachment forms easily. These objects represented continuity, something stable when everything else shifted. Loneliness also altered perception of time. Nights felt endless, days blurred together. Without regular human interaction, memory softened at the edges. Men lost track of dates. Seasons became markers instead. Before snow, after thaw. This disorientation could be calming or unsettling depending on temperament. Not everyone experienced isolation the same way. Some trappers worked in pairs or small groups rotating nights together. Others deliberately chose solitude, believing it sharpened focus. Accounts contradict one another, here reflecting personal preference more than shared experience. What comforted one man unsettled another. You feel the fire crackle softly, a reminder that something responds when you act. This responsiveness matters. It grounds you. Loneliness feeds on stagnation. Movement, even small, breaks its hold. Mountain men learn to keep busy at night, repairing gear, planning routes, recounting memories in detail. Storytelling played a larger role than often acknowledged. Men rehearsed tales in their heads, preparing them for future audiences. Some exaggerated, some polished language. This mental exercise served two purposes. It entertained the mind and preserved identity. You are still someone with stories to tell. There is mention in a few accounts of men carving small objects during winter nights. Simple figures, notches on sticks, decorative patterns on handles. These acts were not productive in a practical sense, but they filled time and created meaning. Creativity, even minimal, countered isolation. Loneliness also influenced risk. Men desperate for contact sometimes travelled farther than necessary, seeking camps or rendezvous early. Others withdrew further, avoiding potential conflict. Both responses appear in the record, shaped by personality and past experience. You notice how the cold itself becomes company. It is constant, predictable, demanding attention. In a strange way, it replaces social interaction. You respond to it. It responds in turn. The relationship feels one-sided but consistent. Some men describe the cold almost affectionately in later writing as something that tested them honestly. Sleep offers partial escape. Dreams bring faces back briefly. Voices return. Then morning comes and the quiet settles again. This cycle repeats until spring or until movement brings change. There is no clear agreement among those who studied these lives about how damaging isolation truly was. Some men emerged resilient, even fond of solitude. Others faded, losing motivation and eventually abandoning the life. The mountain selected not just for physical endurance but for psychological fit. You lie still listening to your own breath. It feels louder than it should. You slow it, deliberately counting exhales. This simple act calms the mind. The fire glows steadily. The shelter holds. You're not alone in danger, even if you are alone in presence. As the night deepens, loneliness softens slightly. Familiar routines replace unease. You know what comes next. Feed the fire, shift bedding, rest. Predictability comforts where people are absent. Mountain men did not conquer loneliness. They lived alongside it, accepted it as part of the price. Some nights it pressed hard, other nights it barely whispered. Learning to coexist with it mattered as much as learning to stay warm. You close your eyes again, aware of the vast dark beyond your shelter. It no longer feels empty. It feels quiet, waiting, holding space rather than threatening it. In this stillness you remain present, alone but steady. The night continues, and so do you. You become aware of movement beyond the firelight, not as a clear shape, but as a suggestion, a shift in shadow, a sound that does not belong to wind or settling snow. Out here, animals are never far, and winter draws them closer to the same scarce resources you depend on: warmth, food, shelter from wind. Horses, if you have one, are your first concern. They are both lifeline and liability. A horse carries loads, shortens travel, and offers companionship, but it also needs care. You imagine checking its flank, brushing snow from its back, listening to steady breathing. In deep, cold horses burned calories fast. Men learned to shelter them carefully, using trees or terrain to block wind. Losing a horse in winter could end a season instantly. Dogs appear in some winter camps as well, especially among men who travelled frequently with indigenous groups. Dogs alerted sleepers to approaching animals and strangers. They also shared warmth. You picture a dog curling close body heat, pressed against your legs. This simple presence eased loneliness and sharpened safety at the same time. Wild animals move differently in winter. Wolves travelled farther, thinner, more desperate. Their howls carried easily through cold air, long and layered. You hear one now in your imagination, distant but clear. It is not necessarily a threat. Wolves avoided humans when possible, but hunger made behaviour unpredictable. Some trappers slept more lightly when wolves were near, waking at every sound. Others ignored them completely, trusting fire and numbers. Experience shaped reaction. Panic wasted energy. Calm preserved it. Smaller animals mattered too. Mice and squirrels crept toward camps drawn by food scraps and warmth. They gnawed leather, stole fat, and startled sleepers. You imagine waking to faint scratching heart racing briefly, before realizing the source. Annoying, yes. Dangerous not usually, still vigilance mattered. There is a quiet practice mentioned in passing in several winter accounts. Men hung food and grease away from sleeping areas, sometimes suspended from branches or placed far downwind. This reduced animal interest and helped sleep come easier. Forgetting this step led to restless nights and chewed gear. Predators were not the only concern. Livestock or pack animals could panic at night, breaking loose and running. Tracking them in snow was possible but exhausting. Many men tied animals securely yet loosely enough to prevent injury. Balance again. Too tight caused harm. Too loose invited escape. You notice how companionship changed perception of cold. Sitting alone the night felt vast. Sitting with an animal nearby, even silently, it felt contained. Breathing synced. Presence grounded attention. This effect was subtle but powerful. Not every mountain man welcomed animals close. Some worried about drawing predators. Others disliked added responsibility. Accounts vary, widely shaped by region, season, and personality. What worked one winter failed the next. You shift closer to the fire listening. A branch cracks. Snow slides. Your hand rests on your knife, not in fear but readiness. Readiness becomes habit here. It calms rather than alarms. Animals also served as warning systems. Birds flushed suddenly, horses snorted, dogs stiffened. These cues mattered more than sight at night. You learn to trust them often before understanding why. The cold itself altered animal behaviour. Sound travelled farther. Sense lingered longer. Movement slowed. Everything felt closer than it was. This compression of space heightened awareness. It made nights feel more intense. You remember stories of men waking to find animals pressed close, sharing warmth unintentionally. A deer sheltering near camp, a fox curled behind a log. These moments were not common, but they were remembered vividly perhaps because they blurred lines between threat and kinship. As the night deepens, activity quiets. Animals settle. Hunger pauses until morning. You feel the world exhale slightly. The fire glows steady. The shelter holds. You realize that surviving cold nights was never a solitary act, even when no other humans were present. You shared space with creatures navigating the same challenges. Awareness of them sharpened your own instincts. You lie back, listening again. The night feels occupied now, not empty. Life moves quietly around you, respecting boundaries drawn by fire and patience. In this shared landscape, you remain alert but calm. Animals pass through, you stay. The cold watches all of you equally indifferent to species. As sleep returns in shallow waves, you accept this coexistence. You're not alone in the Rockies at night. You're simply another warm body negotiating darkness until morning arrives. You lift your eyes toward the sky because weather speaks long before it arrives. In the Rockies, winter does not always announce itself with drama. Often it whispers first, and mountain men learn to listen. A shift in wind direction. A halo around the moon. stars that seemed sharper than usual. These signs mattered especially at night when surprises carried higher cost. You feel the air change on your face, it tightens, dries. The wind settles into an uneasy stillness. This quiet can feel peaceful, but it often signals a drop in temperature. Men who ignored it sometimes woke to frost, thick enough to stiffen blankets and freeze water solid inside containers. You imagine crouching by the fire, watching smoke behavior. If it rises straight up, weather is stable. If it hugs the ground, something is changing. This observation appears again and again in winter recollections. It required no tools, just attention. Smoke became a messenger. Clouds told stories too. Thin high streaks meant one thing. Heavy low cover meant another. Snow falling softly often brought insulation. Clear skies could be more dangerous, allowing heat to radiate away rapidly. Men learned that the prettiest nights were sometimes the coldest. Alongside observation lived belief. Superstition crept into winter camps quietly. Some men trusted signs passed down through stories rather than direct experience. A sudden ringing in the ears, a restless horse, a fire that refused to catch. These moments took on meaning when survival depended on anticipation. You sense how fear and intuition blurred. Acting too early wasted energy. Acting too late risked disaster. Mountain men developed a tolerance for uncertainty, making adjustments gradually rather than reacting sharply. Add wood to the fire, tighten shelter edges, move gear closer. These small responses prepared them for whatever came next. There is mention in some journals of men talking to the weather, half joking, half serious, cursing it, bargaining with it, thanking it when storms passed without incident. This anthropomorphism may sound childish, but it provided emotional release. Naming the threat made it feel less overwhelming. Not everyone trusted signs the same way. One man might swear by moon halos, another dismissed them entirely. Outcomes varied. Sometimes superstition aligned with reality. Sometimes it failed spectacularly. Winter offered no guarantees. You imagine watching the stars shift slowly using their movement as a crude clock. Time mattered when predicting weather. Storms often arrived at predictable hours, riding temperature changes. Experience sharpened this sense. After enough nights, men felt patterns rather than calculating them. A small but telling habit appears in winter camps. Some trappers place sticks or feathers upright in the snow before sleeping, checking them when they woke. If wind had shifted or increased, the markers told the story. Simple, effective, and silent. As the night progresses, the air thickens slightly. Clouds drift in softening starlight. Snow begins to fall, barely audible. Relief follows. Snow blankets the land, insulating it. The cold eases its bite. You pull your blanket closer, grateful for this quiet mercy. Blizzards were another matter entirely. They erased signs and overwhelmed preparation. Men caught in sudden storms sometimes built emergency shelters, on the spot trusting instinct more than plan. Stories of these moments vary wildly, shaped by fear and survival. Some men remembered them as near-death experiences. Others treated them as harsh but manageable. You feel how weather awareness shaped sleep. On stable nights, rest deepened. On uncertain nights, vigilance lingered. The body learned to respond to subtle cues even in half sleep. A drop in temperature nudged you awake. A gust rattled the shelter just enough to demand attention. Weather also shaped morale. Clear mornings lifted spirits. Endless storms weighed heavily. Men spoke less. Movement slowed. Patience wore thin. Winter tested not just bodies but tempers. There is no single set of rules preserved in writing. Advice contradicted itself. One man swore by moving camp before storms, another insisted on staying put. Both survived long enough to write about it. This inconsistency reflects the truth of the mountains. They rewarded flexibility, not dogma. You feel the wind return softly now, brushing snow against the shelter. The fire responds with a change in sound, a deeper crackle. You adjust logs without standing fully. These movements feel automatic now, guided by cues rather than thought. The cold settles into a new rhythm, not as sharp, not as gentle, just present. You listen not for silence but for change. This listening becomes habit, almost restful in its own way. Mountain men did not predict weather perfectly, they adapted to it. This distinction mattered. Prediction failed often, adaptation worked often enough. As snow thickens, the world grows quieter. Sound dampens, edges soften. The night feels enclosed, protective even. You breathe easier, trusting the shelter to hold under this new weight. By morning, tracks will vanish. The land will reset. Signs you read tonight will be gone. This impermanence defined winter life. Nothing stayed the same long enough to rely on memory alone. You close your eyes briefly, then open them again. The fire glows steady. The shelter creaks softly. The weather has spoken for now, and you've answered. In the Rockies, winter nights rewarded those who listened more than those who believed they knew. Tonight you listen. That is enough. You notice the first warning not as pain but as absence. Sensation fades quietly, starting at the edges. Fingers feel thick. Toes feel distant. The cold does not announce injury loudly. It waits for inattention. Mountain men learned that the most dangerous moments came when discomfort eased instead of intensified. You flex your hands slowly, watching how movement brings back prickling awareness. That tingling hurts a little, but it reassures you. Pain means circulation is still trying. Numbness without pain raises concern. This distinction became instinctive to those who live through winters like this. Winter journals describe hands cracking open along knuckles, skin splitting despite layers of grease and hide, lips bled, ears stiffened. These injuries were common, accepted almost casually, but they carried risk. Open skin froze faster. Infection followed easily. Care at night mattered as much as caution during the day. You imagine rubbing animal fat into your hands, the smell strong and clinging. It feels slick, uncomfortable, but it seals skin against wind and moisture. Men did this repeatedly, sometimes, obsessively, especially before sleep. Dry skin invited damage. Grease bought time. Feet demanded constant attention. Boots came off near the fire, socks were dried carefully. Toes were examined by touch when light was poor. Men pressed, flexed, rubbed gently. Sudden heat was avoided. Bringing frozen skin too close to flame caused worse injury than cold itself. Experience taught restraint. You think about the confusion that could follow severe cold exposure. Men described feeling strangely warm just before things went wrong. Judgment softened. Movement slowed. This false comfort was dangerous. Companions sometimes noticed it, first pulling men closer to fire or forcing them to move. Not all injuries were immediate. Frost damage sometimes revealed itself days later, skin darkening or blistering. Accounts differ on how often men lost fingers or toes outright. Some stories emphasize dramatic losses. Others mention long-term stiffness, reduced feeling, and chronic pain. The truth varied widely, shaped by severity and response. You notice how prevention mattered more than treatment. Covering skin early, adjusting layers before numbness set in, moving gently to restore circulation. Mountain men learned to treat cold injuries as ongoing processes rather than single events. There is mention in a few recollections of men testing sensation by touching metal briefly. Metal stole heat quickly. If skin stuck or burned instantly, it was time to act. This test was risky, but it provided information when light was low and uncertainty high. Hands were particularly vulnerable during camp chores, handling water, processing meat, tending fire. Gloves came off often. Men learned to rotate tasks, warming hands between actions. Efficiency mattered less than preservation. You feel how attention narrows when cold injury threatens. Thoughts simplify, priorities clarify. Everything else recedes until warmth returns. This focus can feel calming, almost meditative, even as danger looms. There was no universal agreement on best remedies. Some men swore by gentle rubbing, others by gradual warming near embers. A few believed snow rubbing prevented worse damage. Outcomes varied. Success depended on timing, severity, and luck. You imagine the long nights spent monitoring injured fingers, waking repeatedly to check colour and feeling. Sleep fractured further, anxiety crept in. Injury threatened not just comfort, but livelihood. A damaged hand meant poor trapping, poor hunting, slower travel. Yet many men recovered fully. Skin toughened over time, circulation adapted, bodies learned cold tolerance gradually, not through bravado, but through repeated exposure paired with care. This adaptation did not make them immune. It made them aware. Cold also affected joints. Knees stiffened, shoulders ached. Old injuries flared. Men stretched slowly before sleep, and upon waking, keeping movement gentle but constant. Stillness invited stiffness. Motion preserved function. You shift your own fingers now, imagining that vigilance, wiggle, flex, press palm to palm. The fire responds with a soft crackle, warmth spreading outward again. Relief settles slowly, not dramatic, but real. Some winter injuries never fully healed. Men carried them for life, numb patches, limited movement, pain during cold weather years later. These marks became quiet reminders of nights survived. Yet injury did not always end a season. Many men adjusted, relying on companions or changing roles temporarily. Resilience showed not in avoidance of harm, but in adaptation afterward. You notice how these injuries rarely feature prominently in heroic retellings. They lack drama. They are slow, incremental, inconvenient, but they defined daily winter life more than sudden danger ever did. As the night continues, you remain attentive. You check extremities again. Warmth holds, sensation remains. For now, you are safe. You realize that surviving the coldest nights depended less on endurance than on responsiveness. Feeling noticing acting early. Cold punished neglect more than weakness. The fire glows steadily. Your shelter holds. Your body rests alert but calmer. Injury has been avoided tonight not through toughness, but through care. You settle back into bedding fingers, tucked close toes flexed lightly. The cold remains present but contained. You breathe slowly, grateful for sensation, for awareness, for another quiet victory against the creeping numbness. The night stretches on, but you are still intact, and in winter intact is enough. You realize that true rest never fully arrives out here. Even when your body sinks into stillness, some part of you stays awake listening. Night watches were not always formal shifts with spoken rules. Often they were instinctive, shaped by light sleep and sudden awareness. Mountain men learned to exist in this in-between state, where rest and vigilance overlapped. You lie with eyes closed, yet sounds register immediately. A change in wind pitch, the fire popping differently, snow sliding from a branch. Each noise passes through you without panic, catalogued quietly. This awareness keeps fear from blooming. Fear wastes energy. Calm attention preserves it. In some camps, men took turns staying awake, especially when travelling together. One man fed the fire while another rested. Then they switched. These arrangements were rarely rigid. Fatigue, weather, and trust shaped them. On bitter nights, everyone slept lightly, waking as needed rather than on schedule. You imagine sitting upright beside the fire, knees drawn up, blanket wrapped tightly. The glow paints hands and boots in warm light. Shadows sway gently. This posture feels uncomfortable at first, but it keeps circulation active and prevents deep chill from settling. Many men preferred it to lying flat during the coldest hours. Sleep deprivation carried its own risks. Slower reactions, clouded judgment. Men who stayed awake too long sometimes made mistakes at dawn, stumbling or misreading terrain. Balancing rest and watchfulness required constant adjustment. There was no perfect solution, only better compromises. You notice how paranoia could creep in during long nights. The mind filled silence with imagined threats. Every sound felt intentional. Mountain men learn to test these thoughts gently rather than indulge them. Listen twice. Wait. Let the sound repeat or fade. Most danger announced itself clearly. Imagined danger dissolved quickly if ignored. Fire tending anchored these hours. Feeding embers became a ritual grounding attention. Hands moved almost automatically, wood placed just so. Ash shifted gently. These small acts reassured you that warmth would continue. Routine calmed nerves better than any bravado. There are stories of men waking suddenly convinced something was wrong, only to find nothing changed at all. Others slept through real danger and woke just in time. These moments shaped individual habits. A man startled easily learned to slow his response. A heavy sleeper learned to rely on companions or animals for warning. You feel how the cold sharpens hearing. Sound travels farther at night, carried cleanly through dense air. A snapped twig feels closer than it is. This compression of space can be unsettling. You remind yourself to judge distance carefully, resisting the urge to react instantly. Some men use simple tricks to stay alert without exhausting themselves. Chewing dried meat slowly, sipping warm broth if available, shifting position often. These actions kept blood moving and mind engaged without full wakefulness. You imagine glancing at the stars, using their position to mark time. Orion rising, the Big Dipper turning. This slow movement reassures you that night is progressing, not endless. Time exists even when it feels suspended. There is no single memory preserved about how often danger actually arrived during these watches. Some men remembered weeks of quiet nights. Others recalled sudden encounters with animals or strangers. The unevenness of experience made every night feel uncertain, even when most passed uneventfully. You notice how alertness changes your relationship with the dark. Instead of something to fear, it becomes a field of information. Shapes, sounds, and smells carry meaning. This reframing reduces anxiety. Unknown becomes observable. Fatigue eventually presses harder. Eyelids droop. You adjust closer to the fire, letting warmth support you. You allow brief sleep, trusting yourself to wake if needed. This trust grows slowly, built through nights where nothing goes wrong. There is a quiet pride in staying awake when others rest. It feels purposeful. Yet there is also relief when it is your turn to sleep more deeply. Community when present eased this burden. Alone you learned to share it with the night itself. You listen again. Silence returns, not empty but settled. The fire breathes steadily, snow continues to fall softly. No footsteps, no growls, no raised voices, just the land holding its breath. You realize that paranoia and preparedness sit close together. The difference lies in response. Preparedness watches calmly. Paranoia reacts sharply. Mountain men survived by leaning toward the former even when nerves frayed. As the night stretches on, vigilance becomes less effortful. Your body adapts. Awareness settles into the background like a low hum. You rest without surrendering completely. This state feels strange at first, but eventually it becomes familiar, almost comforting. You adjust the fire one last time before dawn. Embers glow red. Heat radiates softly. The darkest hour passes unnoticed because you are awake enough to feel the shift when it ends. Morning light will come soon. Until then, you remain here, part of the quiet machinery that keeps warmth alive through the night, watching, listening, waiting without fear. In the Rockies, surviving the coldest nights often depended not on heroic action, but on this simple discipline. Stay aware, stay calm, let the night move around you without pulling you into its stories. You breathe slowly, eyes half closed, and keep watch until the world begins to lighten again. As the night thins toward morning, your hands find work again. This is the quiet hour when small repairs decide how the next day will feel. Mountain men rarely waited for daylight to fix what mattered. Firelight was enough, and sometimes it was safer. The cold made materials brittle. Waiting invited failure. You pull a worn strap, closer fingers stiff but steady. Leather creaks softly as you flex it. The smell of hide and smoke mixes in a way that feels familiar now. Repairs are not dramatic. They are patient. A stitch here. A tightened knot there. Each small correction prevents a larger problem later. Knives are kept close always. Blades dull, faster in winter, scraping against frozen wood and bone. You imagine honing carefully, listening to the faint rasp of stone on steel. Too much pressure chips the edge. Too little wastes effort. This balance mirrors everything else out here. Needles pass through thick hide with effort. Thimbles were rare, so men used bonewood or even cartridge casings to protect fingers. You feel the resistance, the slight give as needle breaks through. Each stitch pulls warmth from your hands, but stopping would cost more heat than continuing. Many winter journals mention how often gear failed at night. Straps snapped. Moccasin seams opened. Blanket ties loosened. These moments rarely ended lives directly, but they eroded comfort and confidence. Fixing them immediately restored both. You notice how firelight changes your perception of colour. Everything glows amber. Shadows soften edges. This limited vision demanded memory. You worked by feel as much as sight, knowing where holes usually formed where stress collected. Experience guided hands when eyes could not. Some men preferred to repair gear before sleeping, others after waking. Both habits appear in recollections. The choice often depended on fatigue. Exhaustion dulled hands. Too tired meant mistakes. Too alert meant restlessness. You learn to judge your own state, choosing work or sleep accordingly. There is a small habit mentioned casually in several accounts. Men often warm tools briefly near the fire before using them. Cold metal numbed fingers quickly. Warmed metal moved more easily and reduced fumbling. This simple step saved frustration and pain. You adjust a moccasin seam, now tightening sinew carefully. The material shrinks as it cools. A seam too tight splits by morning. A seam too loose lets in snow. You pull just enough, trusting feel more than measurement. Gear repair also fills the mind. It gives thought somewhere to rest. Loneliness eases when hands are busy. Worry fades into focus. This quiet concentration becomes a kind of meditation, one that fits the rhythm of winter nights. You remember stories of men losing essential tools and improvising replacements from bone antler or wood. Necessity sharpened creativity. A broken awl became a sharpened nail. A torn strap became braided hide. These solutions were not elegant, but they worked. The cold stiffens thread quickly. You blow gently on fingers, warming them just enough to continue. Breath fogs briefly, then clears. The fire responds with a soft crackle as if acknowledging the effort. Some repairs wait for daylight because they require more light or strength. Others cannot wait. Knowing the difference mattered. A loose shelter tie in rising wind demanded immediate attention. A worn pack seam could hold until morning. You feel satisfaction as the last knot settles. The gear feels solid again. This small success brings disproportionate comfort. Out here, reliability equals peace. Tools are returned carefully to their places. Organization matters at night. Dropping a needle or knife into snow could mean losing it forever. You move deliberately, conscious of every motion. There is a quiet economy to these moments. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. Repairs are done once done right or done again soon. Men who rushed paid later. You sit back briefly, flexing fingers, feeling warmth return slowly. The ache in joints reminds you of work done. This ache feels earned. It does not threaten, it reassures. Gear repair also serves as preparation for dawn. Morning travel depends on functional equipment. Fixing things now saves precious daylight later. Winter days are short. Wasting them on preventable problems risks hunger and cold. You glance toward the sky. Stars fade slightly. Morning is approaching. The fire burns lower now, steady and reliable. You feed it gently, not wanting a blaze, just warmth. There is no record of anyone enjoying these repairs in the moment, yet many later remembered them fondly, perhaps because they represented control. In a world ruled by weather and chance, fixing something with your own hands restored agency. You gather scraps of hide and sinew, tucking them away. Even waste has value here. Scraps become ties. Fragments become patches. Nothing is truly useless until it fails completely. As you settle back into bedding, you feel the night shift again. The worst cold is past. The horizon lightens imperceptibly. Your gear is ready. Your body rests easier, knowing fewer problems wait ahead. Repairing by firelight does more than maintain equipment. It maintains confidence. Each stitch says you're still capable, still attentive, still adapting. Mountain men survived cold nights not because they endured hardship passively, but because they responded constantly, adjusting, fixing, improving. This habit carried them through seasons when strength alone would not. You close your eyes, now hands tucked, close tools within reach. The fire glows softly. The shelter creaks faintly. Your gear rests repaired beside you. Another night nearly finished. Another set of small victories secured quietly without drama. This is how survival accumulates. Not through single bold acts, but through many careful ones stitched together by firelight and patience. You notice how the hardest part of the night is not always the cold itself, but the way it creeps into your thoughts. When the fire is steady and your body is warm enough, the mind still wanders. Mountain men learned that endurance was as much mental as physical, and winter nights demanded tricks that worked quietly without stirring the body. You lie still, eyes half closed, and guide your thoughts on purpose. Letting them roam freely invites worry, so you give them something simple to hold. Counting breaths, replaying the day's route in your head, planning tomorrow's first task in careful detail. These small exercises keep the mind busy without raising the heart rate. Many winter accounts hint at routines that were never written down as advice but practiced instinctively. Men repeated the same actions every night. Same order, same pace, fire, food, gear, bedding. Repetition created familiarity, and familiarity calmed nerves. When everything else changed, daily routine became a shelter of its own. You hum softly under your breath, barely audible. A simple tune, maybe one you barely remember the words to. Sound vibrates in your chest, grounding you in your body. Singing quietly appears again and again in personal recollections, not as performance, but as comfort. It kept loneliness from growing teeth. You imagine telling yourself a story not aloud, but internally. A memory from home, a hunt that went well, a river crossed safely. These stories are not for entertainment alone. They remind you that time exists beyond this night, that life stretches backward and forward, not just inward toward the cold. Some men recited prayers, others recited nothing but familiar lists, names of rivers, types of trees, equipment inventories. The content mattered less than the rhythm. Rhythm steadied breathing. Breathing steadied warmth. You feel how panic tries to slip in when a sudden gust rattles the shelter. The instinctive reaction is to tense. Instead, you pause, listen. The sound does not repeat. You release the tension deliberately. This ability to interrupt fear was learned slowly, often after nights where fear accomplished nothing but exhaustion. There are mentions in winter narratives of men visualizing warmth, imagining sun on skin, imagining summer grass. This was not naive optimism. It distracted the nervous system just enough to reduce shivering. Whether it truly raised body temperature is unknown, but it clearly helped some men endure longer without distress. You adjust position slightly, then still yourself again. Too much movement wastes heat. too little invites stiffness. Finding the balance becomes intuitive over time. The body learns when to move and when to remain quiet. Humour appears unexpectedly in these moments. Gentle sarcasm even directed inward. Complaints spoken quietly to the cold. Mock threats toward the wind. Laughing softly at discomfort reduced its power. Men who could joke survived nights that broke others. You notice how attention shifts inward during long nights. Sounds fade, thoughts slow. The mind drifts into a shallow dream state while the body remains alert. This half-sleep feels strange at first, but it becomes familiar, even welcome. It allows rest without surrender. Some men describe naming the hours marking progress through the night mentally. First watch, middle dark. Cold hour, near dawn. This segmentation made time feel manageable. Instead of enduring an endless stretch, you move through smaller pieces. You find yourself listening to your heartbeat. Steady, reliable. It reassures you more than silence. As long as it continues, you're still negotiating successfully with the night. Occasionally thoughts drift toward fear anyway. Injury, hunger, weather turning suddenly. When this happens, experienced men redirected attention quickly. They didn't argue with fear. They replaced it. Feed the fire, check the shelter, feel the blanket. Action dissolved worry more effectively than thought. You remember reading how some men carried small objects from home, a button, a coin, a scrap of cloth. Touching it during long nights anchored memory and identity. These objects were rarely valuable, but they were powerful. They reminded men who they were beyond survival. You press your hand against your chest, now feeling warmth beneath layers. This physical reassurance matters. The body listens to touch more readily than to logic. Sleep returns in shallow waves. Dreams flicker briefly then fade. You wake without alarm, adjust and drift again. This rhythm feels natural now, no longer frustrating. You stop expecting full rest. You accept partial rest as sufficient. As the night thins, your thoughts grow quieter. The mind, having worked through its worries, settles into calm observation. The fire glows, the shelter holds. The cold remains present, but familiar. Mountain men did not conquer fear through bravado. They learned to manage it gently, redirecting attention rather than suppressing emotion. This subtle skill mattered as much as any physical technique. You feel pride in this quiet mastery, though it is not loud or dramatic. It is the pride of remaining steady, of not letting discomfort dictate behavior, of meeting the night on its own terms. Your breathing slows further. Muscles soften. The cold loosens its grip slightly as dawn approaches. You do not need to watch for it. Your body senses the shift. As pale light begins to filter through branches, you rest more deeply at last. The worst is behind you. Another night endured not through force, but through patience, routine, and gentle mental discipline. You remained still, letting the final moments of darkness pass without resistance. The tricks you used tonight will be used again. They're quiet companions, reliable and unnoticed, carrying you through the cold when strength alone would not. You begin to sense how winter rewrites every other memory you have of the mountains. Places that felt generous in summer now feel guarded. Trails that once welcomed your steps narrow into careful lines of choice. The same land exists, but it behaves differently, and you have learned to behave differently with it. You think back to warmer seasons when nights were short and forgiving. In summer you could sleep anywhere without much thought. Fire was pleasant, not essential. Clothing dried quickly. Food was easier to find. Mistakes rarely carried lasting consequences. Winter strips all that away. It demands intention at every turn. Men who travelled these mountains year-round noticed the contrast sharply. Letters and journals often describe winter as a separate country, layered on top of the same geography. Rivers froze into bridges and traps at the same time. Meadows vanished beneath snow. Familiar landmarks disappeared. Navigation shifted from memory to instinct. You feel how winter slows everything. Distance stretches. Tasks take longer. Daylight shrinks. Even thinking seems heavier. This slowness can frustrate at first, but those who survived learn to accept it. Fighting the pace wasted energy. Matching it conserved strength. Summer allowed improvisation. Winter punished it. A forgotten blanket in July was uncomfortable. In January it was catastrophic. This difference shaped behaviour long before nightfall. Men planned evenings earlier. Camps were chosen with more care. Supplies were checked obsessively. You notice how sound behaves differently too. Summer nights buzzed with insect and running water. Winter nights fall quiet, broken only by wind or distant animals. This quiet magnifies awareness. It also magnifies mistakes. A dropped tool echoes farther. A careless step carries longer. Cold also changed relationships between men. In warmer months, tempers flared more easily. Movement relieved tension. In winter, cooperation mattered more. Sharing warmth, sharing food, sharing labour kept everyone alive. Even solitary men understood this when they met others. Winter encouraged brief alliances, quiet agreements, mutual tolerance. You imagine how clothing shifted with the seasons. Summer garments focused on protection from sun and brush. Winter layers became systems adjusted constantly. What you wore during the day might kill you at night if damp. This awareness shaped how men moved, rested and worked. Food followed the same pattern. Summer offered variety. Winter offered necessity. Fat replaced freshness. Calories replaced flavour. This simplification affected mood. Meals lost celebration and gained purpose. Eating became maintenance rather than pleasure. You notice how the body itself adapts. Muscles harden. Skin thickens. Sensation dulls slightly, not from damage, but from acclimation. This adaptation takes time. Early winter feels harsher than late winter, even when temperatures are similar. The body learns what to expect. Some men preferred winter travel despite the hardship. Snow preserved tracks. Insects vanished. Water sources stayed consistent once frozen. These advantages balanced the cold for certain tasks. Others avoided winter, entirely retreating to lower ground or settlements. Both choices reflect different tolerances, not courage or weakness. Nighttime routines changed most dramatically. In summer nights were rest. In winter nights were work. Feeding fires, adjusting layers, checking shelter. Sleep became active rather than passive. This constant engagement defined winter survival more than any single technique. You feel how memory itself changes. Summer memories blur together. Winter nights stand apart, each one distinct. The cold sharpens recall. Men remembered specific nights, decades later, recalling weather hunger and small decisions with clarity. The mountains feel heavier in winter, not physically but emotionally. Silence carries weight. Darkness feels thicker. Yet there is also a strange beauty. Snow reflects starlight. Frost turns simple shapes into delicate patterns. The land reveals details hidden in abundance. You sense how winter teaches restraint. It discourages excess. It punishes bravado. It rewards patience. These lessons linger even when seasons change. Men who survived winters carried this mindset into spring and summer, moving more deliberately, wasting less. As dawn approaches, you reflect on this contrast. Winter nights demanded everything. Summer nights asked little. The difference reshaped how mountain men understood comfort, risk and reward. You rest now with a deeper appreciation for why winter stood apart in their stories. It was not just colder, it was more honest. It stripped life down to essentials and revealed what mattered most. The fire glows low. The sky lightens slightly. Another winter night nears its end, and with it comes the quiet understanding that surviving here meant adapting to the season you were in, not the one you wished for. You breathe slowly, letting that lesson settle. The mountains remain the same. You have changed. You lean a little closer to the fire, not because you are colder, but because this is where voices used to gather. Even when you are alone now, the space feels crowded with echoes. Winter nights invited stories the way daylight invited work. When movement slowed and darkness stretched, words filled the gaps. You imagine the cadence of those voices, low and deliberate. Stories were rarely rushed. They unfolded slowly, shaped by pauses and crackling wood. A tale told too quickly felt wrong, as if it wasted the night. Men learned to pace their words the same way they paced their steps in snow. Some stories were practical, disguised as entertainment. A tale about a man who ignored wind direction and paid for it by morning. Another about someone who trusted thin ice once and never again. These stories taught without lecturing. Listening felt easier than instruction, especially when pride was involved. Other stories grew larger each time they were told. Distances stretched. Cold deepened, success sharpened, failures softened or vanished entirely. This was not always intentional. Memory changed under repetition. Winter nights blurred truth and embellishment until separating them no longer mattered. You notice how humour slipped into even the bleakest tales. A man laughed at his own misery months later, turning frostbitten toes into a punchline. Laughter loosened fear. It also reminded everyone that survival did not require solemnity at all times. There were stories meant purely to pass time, accounts of faraway places, rumours of easy land, descriptions of towns most listeners would never see. These stories carried warmth of a different kind. They pulled minds away from the present moment just long enough to ease tension. Some men told the same story every winter, word for word, as if repetition itself brought comfort. Others refused to repeat stories, believing they lost power when retold. Both habits appear in recollections shaped by personality rather than tradition. You picture hands gesturing in firelight, faces half seen, half imagined, shadows exaggerated expressions. A nod or raised eyebrow carried meaning. Silence often followed important moments, letting the fire speak instead. Stories also served as currency. A good storyteller earned attention and patience. His advice travelled farther because it came wrapped in narrative. A dull speaker, even with useful knowledge, struggled to be heard. Winter nights rewarded those who could hold focus gently. Not all stories were true. Some were meant to impress newcomers or test gullibility. Men listened carefully, weighing details. A claim that sounded too neat raised suspicion. Experience taught which voices to trust. You feel how these stories shape behaviour long after the fire burned out. A remembered mistake from someone else prevented your own. A remembered success suggested a new approach. Stories extended learning beyond personal experience, saving time and sometimes lives. There were quieter stories too, shared only once. Confessions, regrets, memories of people left behind. These moments required trust. The night felt safe enough to hold them. Cold created intimacy by narrowing attention inward. You imagine lying back after such a night, the last story fading as embers dimmed. Sleep came easier when the mind was full of words rather than worry. Stories organized thought. They gave shape to experience. As you sit now alone with a fire, you realize you have inherited these stories simply by imagining them. They still serve the same purpose. They fill silence. They soften fear. They remind you that others have sat where you sit and felt what you feel. The cold presses gently. The fire answers steadily. In the space between stories linger not loud, not urgent, but present. You let them drift through your thoughts without clinging. Another night deepens. Words fade back into quiet. The land remains patient as ever, and you rest easier, held not just by shelter and flame, but by the long human habit of telling stories into the dark. You begin to notice the presence of lives that rarely appear in the louder stories. Winter did not belong only to solitary men wrapped in hides by a fire. Other people endured these nights too often without the freedom to wander away when conditions worsened. Their survival looked quieter, steadier, and just as demanding. You imagine a camp where children sleep close together, bodies pressed for warmth, breath rising and falling in uneven rhythms. A woman moves carefully near the fire, adjusting coals without waking anyone. Her movements are practiced economical, shaped by nights like this, repeated over years rather than seasons. Winter here is not an episode, it is a condition. Some mountain men formed families during their years in the Rockies, partnering with indigenous or frontier women. These households carried the same risks as solitary camps, but with more at stake. Feeding more mouths required constant planning. Protecting children from cold demanded relentless attention. Nights were lighter in some ways and heavier in others. You feel how responsibility sharpens awareness. Every draft matters more. Every ember is watched longer. Sleep becomes even shallower. The cold feels more personal when it threatens someone smaller, someone who cannot adjust layers or judge risk alone. Women in these camps carried knowledge that rarely made it into journals. They knew how to manage fires for long hours, how to stretch food without weakening bodies, how to keep clothing dry through days of snow. Their work often happened in the margins before dawn and after dark, when survival decisions were made quietly. You picture hands mending by firelight not as an emergency but as routine. Children's garments adjusted constantly as bodies grew, bedding rearranged through the night as sleepers shifted. These small acts accumulated into survival, just as surely as hunting or trapping. Winter also reshaped family rhythms. Stories replaced games, songs replaced movement. Teaching happened by demonstration rather than instruction. Children learned to stay still, to listen, to respond to subtle cues. These skills kept them alive long before they understood why. Some families travelled together through winter. Others stayed in sheltered valleys waiting for thaw. Choices depended on temperament, resources, and trust in the land. There was no single model. What mattered was adaptation, not adherence to tradition. You sense how emotional warmth mattered here even more than physical warmth. Touch, voice, familiar routines, these grounded children and adults alike. Fear spreads quickly among the young. Calm spreads just as quickly when modelled consistently. Loss touched these families as well. Winter sickness, accidents, hunger. These events rarely appeared in heroic retelling, but they shaped daily decisions deeply. Survival carried grief alongside resilience, woven together rather than separated. You imagine a mother waking before dawn, checking breath, adjusting blankets, listening for changes in wind. This vigilance never rested fully, yet many endured, passing knowledge forward quietly through generations. Men who lived in these households learned different rhythms of winter. They hunted and trapped, but they also returned to shared spaces where silence was gentler. Responsibility altered risk tolerance. Reckless choices faded when others depended on you. You notice how these lives complicate the familiar image of mountain survival. They add layers of patience, care, and continuity. Winter nights were not only trials of endurance, they were also spaces where families held together against the cold. As dawn approaches, you imagine these camps stirring slowly, children waking stiff but alive, fires revived, food shared carefully. Another night survived, not through bravado, but through quiet cooperation. You rest now with this fuller picture in mind. The Rockies held many kinds of endurance, some loud, some invisible, all shaped by the same cold. The fire glows softly, the shelter holds, and you feel the night loosen its grip, making room for morning and the many lives that will rise with it. You wake before dawn with that familiar, uneasy awareness that something is different. Not wrong exactly, just altered. The fire burns lower than expected. The air feels heavier in your chest. Cold seeps closer than it did a few hours ago. These are the moments when winter reminds you how thin the margin really is. Close calls rarely arrive with drama. They announce themselves quietly. A numb finger that does not wake up right away. A bootlace frozen solid when you need it to flex. A cough that lingers longer than it should. Mountain men learned to respect these signs more than obvious danger. Loud threats could be avoided. Subtle ones slipped through defences. You sit up slowly, testing your body. Joints protest, but they move. Toes answer when you flex them. Relief comes not as joy, but as steadiness. You are still capable. That matters. Many men who failed in winter did not collapse suddenly. They accumulated small setbacks until recovery became impossible. Stories passed around fires often centered on these moments. The time someone fell through ice but clawed their way out. The night a fire died and was rebuilt just in time. The morning frostbite was noticed early enough to reverse. These stories were not about death. They were about how close it came without staying. You imagine the memory of waking to find snow blown into a shelter overnight piling against bedding, or realizing a water container cracked and leaked away precious supply. These events forced immediate decisions. Panic offered nothing. Action offered a chance. Luck played a role, though few liked to admit it. Wind shifted just enough. A storm slowed unexpectedly. An animal crossed your path when hunger pressed hardest. Survival did not belong only to the prepared. It also favoured the attentive and the fortunate. You think about the men who didn't wake up. Not always from cold directly. Sometimes from exhaustion. Sometimes from illness made worse by winter stress. Their absence shows up in records as gaps. A name mentioned once and never again. A trapline abandoned. A story unfinished. Yet for every loss, there were many more who survived narrowly and carried that memory forward. These experiences shape behaviour permanently. After one close call, a man might double his bedding, check fires more often, avoid certain valleys entirely. Winter taught through consequence, not instruction. You notice how memory sharpens around danger. Men remembered exact details of near disasters, the sound of cracking ice, the colour of skin just before sensation returned, the way fear narrowed vision. These memories lingered longer than successes. They served as warnings replayed silently in later seasons. There were moments when survival depended on help arriving unexpectedly. Another camp stumbled upon just in time. A companion refusing to sleep when you insisted you were fine. Pride often resisted aid. Wisdom accepted it. Learning to accept help became another survival skill. You feel how responsibility factors in here. Alone, risk tolerance shifts. With others depending on you, caution grows. Men travelling with partners often avoided risks they would have taken solo, not because they were weaker, but because consequences multiplied. Some close calls came from overconfidence built during mild stretches. A few easy nights lulled men into shortcuts. Layers removed too soon. Fires fed less carefully. Winter punished complacency swiftly. The lesson repeated often enough to become tradition. You imagine waking to the sound of someone coughing violently nearby, or to silence where breathing should be. These moments haunted survivors long after the season ended. Winter left marks not always visible. Despite this, most nights ended quietly. That is what makes close calls stand out. The contrast sharpens memory. Surviving did not feel heroic. It felt fragile. You sit by the fire now, warming hands slowly. You think about how many decisions from the past day shaped this moment. The route chosen, the shelter built, the food eaten, each choice nudged the night towards safety or danger. There is a strange calm that follows a close call. Adrenaline fades, replaced by focus. You move more carefully. You listen longer. You waste less. This calm is not relief. It is adjustment. Men who survived winters often carried a quieter confidence afterward. Not bravado, but trust in their own judgment. They learned what warning signs felt like in their bodies. They learned when to stop pushing. These lessons did not disappear with spring. You check your gear again, methodical. Everything accounted for. Everything functional enough. You're still here. That is the measure that matters. The sky lightens slightly at the edge. Dawn is coming. The cold loosens just enough to notice. Another night has passed without catastrophe, though not without reminder. You breathe slowly, letting tension drain. You did not conquer the night, you navigated it. That distinction matters. Winter respects navigation more than strength. As daylight approaches, the memory of this night settles into you. It will resurface later, quietly guiding decisions when fatigue or impatience tempt shortcuts. Mountain men lived with these memories stacked behind their eyes. Each close call sharpened the next winter's instincts. Survival became less about luck and more about listening to what nearly went wrong. You stand carefully now, stretching stiff muscles. The ground holds, the fire responds, your body answers. You move forward carrying this night with you, not as fear but as information. Another day waits, another night will follow. And with each one the line between danger and safety becomes clearer, drawn not by rules, but by lived experience. You begin to wonder how long a body can keep doing this. Not just one night, but night after night, winter after winter. The cold leaves marks that are easy to miss at first. Stiffness that takes longer to fade in the morning. Fingers that do not quite move the same way they used to. Fatigue that settles deeper each season. Mountain men learned that endurance was not infinite even when willpower felt strong. You stretch slowly as dawn grows brighter, feeling where effort has accumulated. Muscles respond but reluctantly. Sleep never fully reset the body here. It only paused the damage long enough to continue. Men who stayed in the mountains year after year often notice subtle changes. Slower starts, shorter days, more frequent rest. Some returned east after a few seasons satisfied or simply worn down. Others stayed longer, adapting their routines to conserve energy. They trapped closer to camp, chose safer routes, avoided unnecessary travel in deep cold. These adjustments were not signs of weakness, they were signs of experience. You imagine conversations at rendezvous, men comparing winters without quite admitting fatigue. Someone jokes about aching joints. Another rubs his hands absent-mindedly. Laughter covers truth. Winter carved itself into bodies quietly, leaving records not written down. The land itself seemed to set limits. Some valleys were abandoned in winter because they demanded too much. Some routes were used once and never again. Memory guided choices as much as maps. A place that nearly killed you once carried a warning forever. You feel how the cold works differently on younger bodies than older ones. Early winters feel sharp and shocking. Later winters feel heavier, more persistent. The body knows what is coming and resists it in advance. This anticipation cost energy of its own. Men who endured many winters often relied more on routine and less on improvisation. Familiar systems reduced strain. The body appreciated predictability. Changing habits introduced risk. Stability became a form of rest. You think about the men who stayed longest. They rarely chased the hardest conditions anymore. They knew which winters to sit out, which routes to avoid, when to wait. Survival shifted from conquest to negotiation. Pride softened. Judgment sharpened. There are accounts of men leaving the mountains not because of injury or hunger, but because the cold had taken its toll slowly. Fingers stiffened permanently. Sleep never came easily anymore. The nights demanded more than they gave back, yet some stayed anyway, unable or unwilling to leave. The mountains had shaped them. Lower elevations felt wrong. The rhythm of winter nights had become familiar, even comforting. Endurance was no longer a test. It was a way of being. You notice how this long view changes the meaning of survival. It is not about lasting forever. It is about knowing when to stop. Knowing when another winter will cost more than it gives. You sit quietly, warming yourself, reflecting on how much energy each night requires. Fire, food, attention, care. The body pays for all of it eventually. Winter never forgets. Mountain men who lasted learned to measure success differently. Not by how much they trapped, not by how far they travelled, but by how intact they remained at spring's arrival. You feel gratitude for this awareness. It tempers ambition. It encourages patience. It reminds you that survival is not just about tonight, but about the nights that follow. As the sun rises higher, warmth begins to return. The cold retreats slightly enough to ease joints and thoughts. You pack slowly, conserving energy. There is no rush. Another winter day waits. Another night will come. How many more you face depends on choices made quietly season after season. You move forward with that knowledge settling into you. Endurance is not endless. Wisdom lies in listening to when the body speaks. You notice how the stories you grew up with feel thinner now. They promise toughness as spectacle, lone figures striding through blizzards without hesitation. Nights passed in dramatic defiance. Standing here feeling the cold seep through careful layers, you understand how incomplete those images were. The reality was quieter, slower, and far more deliberate. You think about how later generations painted mountain men as almost mythical, larger than life, always fearless, always capable. But the nights tell a different story. They were filled with checking and rechecking, with doubt, with small corrections made in the dark. Survival did not look impressive most of the time, it looked cautious. You imagine a modern viewer watching these nights through a cinematic lens. The fire flares higher than it ever should. The hero sleeps deeply undisturbed. Gear never fails. Hunger arrives only for drama. In truth, a fire that large wastes fuel. Deep sleep invites disaster. Gear fails constantly. Hunger lingers even on good days. Men who lived this life rarely spoke about it in grand terms. When they did tell stories, exaggeration crept in later, often for entertainment. Back home, audiences wanted adventure. They wanted danger neatly packaged. The long stretches of quiet vigilance did not translate easily. You feel how myth flattens complexity. It removes the constant calculations. It ignores the mental strain. It skips over the patience required to do nothing when doing something felt tempting. Winter survival was not bold action repeated endlessly. It was restraint practiced over and over. You notice how modern comfort reshapes expectations. Heated shelters, synthetic clothing, food that arrives instantly. These conveniences change how danger is imagined. It becomes something you confront briefly, not something you live inside. Mountain men had no such separation. Cold followed them into sleep, into thought, into memory. You consider how this affects the way we judge them. It is easy to admire bravery from a distance, harder to admire consistency. Yet consistency is what kept them alive, showing up every night with the same care, the same routines, the same attention. Some later retellings focused heavily on violence and conflict, but winter nights were often defined by absence of action. No enemies, no confrontations, just cold hunger and time. Enduring that quiet took a different kind of strength. You feel how myth also erases vulnerability. The moments of fear, the moments of doubt, the nights when confidence slipped, these were not failures, they were part of the experience. Pretending otherwise does not honor survival, it distorts it. Standing here, you sense a clearer picture forming. Mountain men were not invincible. They were adaptable. They learned. They changed. They made mistakes and corrected them. This flexibility mattered more than toughness. You imagine how different choices might look if myths were stripped away. Less emphasis on proving something, more emphasis on preserving something. Life, warmth, awareness. The cold itself exposes myth quickly. It does not respond to bravado. It does not care how strong you believe yourself to be. It responds only to preparation and adjustment. Those who survived learned that lesson deeply. You feel calmer with this understanding. The pressure to perform fades. What remains is respect for the process. The night does not need to be conquered. It needs to be managed. As the fire settles and the stars wheel overhead, the heroic image dissolves further. In its place stands something more human, someone attentive, someone cautious, someone willing to admit limits. You rest easier knowing that survival was never about living up to a story. It was about listening closely and responding honestly. That truth feels more comforting than any legend. The night continues steady and unremarkable, and that you realize is exactly the point. You find yourself carrying the lessons of the night even when the fire burns lower and the cold eases its grip. They do not arrive as rules or maxims. They arrive as sensations, preferences, instincts that guide your hands before thought catches up. Winter teaches quietly, and its teachings linger. You notice how your movements have slowed without effort. Not sluggish, just deliberate. Each step considers balance. Each task begins with a pause. This patience was learned the hard way, but now it feels natural. Rushing feels uncomfortable, almost foreign, as if speed itself carries danger. You realize that the cold has sharpened your sense of what matters. Excess fades quickly. Extra gear, extra words, extra motion. Everything unnecessary costs warmth or attention. Winter pares life down until only essentials remain, and in doing so it clarifies priorities. You remember nights when impatience nearly cost you. A shortcut taken to save time, a fire fed too carelessly, a layer removed too soon. These memories sit close, guiding behavior gently rather than scolding. Experience teaches best when it whispers. You notice how trust shifts as well. You trust your senses more. You trust routines more. You trust others who move carefully rather than confidently. Confidence without awareness now feels hollow. Awareness feels solid. The land itself seems to reward this mindset. When you move slowly, you notice sheltering curves in the terrain. When you pause, you hear subtle changes in wind. When you wait, the right moment often presents itself. Winter does not rush outcomes. It reveals them to those who give it time. You think about how these lessons translate beyond the mountains. Patience in discomfort, attention to small signs, respect for limits. These habits extend easily into other parts of life. Long waits, uncertain paths, quiet endurance. The cold becomes a teacher that follows you home. You feel gratitude for the simplicity winter enforces. Meals may be plain, but they satisfy deeply. Rest may be fragmented, but it refreshes in a different way. Success may be modest, but it feels earned. There is little room for illusion here. You notice how fear has changed shape. It no longer spikes suddenly. It appears earlier, softer as caution. This allows adjustment before panic. Winter trains fear into something useful rather than overwhelming. You think about how many nights it took to learn these lessons. Not one, not even a season. They accumulated slowly, layered like frost on bark. Each night added a thin coating of understanding. The fire crackles gently beside you, no longer demanding constant attention. You sit with your back straight, breathing steady, feeling warmth where it matters most. The cold remains present, but it feels less personal now. It has become part of the environment rather than an adversary. You realize that survival here was never about domination. It was about alignment. Moving with conditions rather than against them, accepting discomfort without letting it dictate action. This alignment brings a strange calm. Even when conditions are harsh, there is less internal conflict. You do what needs to be done without dramatizing it. This calm is perhaps the most valuable lesson winter offers. You imagine carrying this calm forward, into future nights, into unfamiliar challenges. The memory of surviving here becomes a quiet confidence that does not need to prove itself. As daylight strengthens, the night recedes fully. Frost glitters briefly, then fades. The mountains remain unchanged. You have changed subtly but permanently. You stand now stretching gently, feeling capable. Not invincible, capable. That distinction matters. It leaves a room for humility and growth. Winter's lessons do not announce themselves as wisdom. They simply shape behavior until survival feels less like effort and more like rhythm. You take one last look at the fading embers, grateful for what they carried you through. Another night has passed, leaving behind not just memory but understanding. And as you move forward, you do so with fewer illusions and steadier footing, carrying the quiet knowledge that patience, attention, and respect will take you farther than strength alone ever could. You sense it before you see it. A loosening. The night does not end abruptly. It eases. The cold relaxes its grip just enough to be noticeable, like a hand unclenching after hours of tension. This is the last night before the shift, the one where hope begins to move quietly beneath the surface. You sit near the fire watching the sky change shade by shade. Darkness thins from black to deep blue, then to something softer. Stars lose their sharpness. The air still bites, but it does not feel as aggressive. Your breath no longer feels stolen the moment you inhale. Something is turning. Men remembered these nights vividly, not because they were easy, but because they signaled survival. The promise of longer days carried weight. Even if snow still lay deep and rivers stayed locked in ice, the knowledge that light was returning changed how the body felt. Muscles loosened a little faster. Thoughts lifted. You notice how your routines adjust almost without conscious choice. You linger by the fire less anxiously. You feed it less often. You allow yourself a longer stretch of stillness. The fear of the fire dying fades. The fear of waking too cold fades with it. You think back over the nights that came before. Each one demanded attention. Each one cost something. This night feels different because it offers something back. Not warmth yet. Not comfort. Just direction. The mountains look the same, but they feel altered. Snow reflects more light. Shadows soften earlier. Wind carries a different sound, less sharp, more fluid. You breathe it in slowly, letting it settle in your chest. Men who survived many winters learned to recognize this transition. They spoke of it quietly, not wanting to tempt disappointment. Spring still lay weeks away. Storms could still arrive suddenly. But the worst stretch had been crossed. You feel a cautious optimism rise, tempered by experience. You know better than to rush. You know better than to relax fully. Yet something inside you allows itself to anticipate easier nights ahead. You imagine the conversations that happened on nights like this. Fewer stories of hardship, more planning. Routes discussed. Camps evaluated. Traps adjusted with future movement in mind. The focus shifts subtly from enduring to preparing. Your body responds as well. Hunger eases slightly. Sleep deepens just a bit. Shivering stops sooner when you wake. These small changes accumulate into relief. You notice how gratitude surfaces unexpectedly. For a dry blanket. For an intact fire steel. For fingers that still bend properly. The winter has not taken what it might have. That realization brings calm. You sit quietly, listening to the land. Snow drips faintly from branches as temperatures hover closer to change. The sound is soft, irregular, almost musical. You smile without realizing it. There is a temptation to celebrate too early. Some men did and paid for it. They travelled too far, took risks assuming the worst had passed. The mountains corrected that assumption swiftly. Experience teaches patience even in relief. You choose balance. You acknowledge the shift without surrendering vigilance. You plan but do not rush. You rest but do not abandon routine. This measured response feels earned. As the fire burns lower, you allow it. You know you can rebuild it easily now. Confidence replaces anxiety. Confidence grounded in repetition, not bravado. You think about how this night will be remembered later, not for danger, not for drama, but for the feeling of release, the quiet realization that you made it through. Men who lived this life often spoke of winter in terms of thresholds, crossing into it, crossing through it, crossing out of it. This night sits at that final crossing where the weight begins to lift. You lie back, letting the firelight warm your face. You do not need to watch it constantly now. You trust the night to carry itself forward. Sleep comes more smoothly. Dreams are lighter. Thoughts drift toward movement and change rather than endurance. The mind begins to open again. As dawn arrives, it feels gentler. Light spreads more generously. You stretch without grimacing. You sit up without dread. The cold still exists, but it no longer dominates. You understand why men remembered this night even years later. It marks survival without demanding anything further. It asked only that you notice it. You stand slowly taking in the view. The mountains wait unchanged. You are the one who has crossed something. This is not the end of hardship, it is the end of the hardest part. That distinction matters. You gather your gear calmly, already thinking ahead. Trails will open, travel will ease, work will change shape. For now you let yourself enjoy the quiet victory. Another night complete, another winter loosened. And as you move forward, you carry with you the memory of how patience and attention carried you through, right to this moment when the dark finally begins to step aside. You wake into a gentler quiet, the kind that feels earned rather than given. The fire has settled into a soft bed of coals, no longer demanding constant attention. Cold still lives in the air, but it has lost its sharpness. It presses less urgently, as if acknowledging that you endured its longest conversation. You sit for a while before moving, listening to the way morning arrives here. Snow shifts and settles. A bird tests the air with a brief call. Light touches the tops of trees first, then slides downward slowly, patiently. This is not warmth yet, but it is permission to breathe more easily. You think about all the nights that led here. The first uncertain evening. The careful choices. The constant adjustments. None of them felt heroic at the time. They felt necessary. Looking back, you understand that survival was built from attention layered over patience. You gather your things without rush. Gear feels familiar, now shaped to your habits. Clothing settles easily, tools fall into place. Nothing feels foreign. This familiarity brings calm. The mountains have not changed, but your relationship with them has. You notice how the fire no longer feels like a lifeline. It is still important, but not desperate. You feed it lightly, knowing you can leave it and return without fear. That confidence is quiet and deep, not loud or careless. As you step away from the shelter, you look back once. Branches bent by snow, bedding packed down, ash scattered thinly, evidence of a night lived fully and left respectfully. Nothing grand, nothing wasted. You feel warmth move through you as you walk, generated by motion rather than flame. The cold allows it now. Your body accepts movement without protest. This cooperation feels like a gift. The mountains stretch out ahead unchanged and vast. They do not mark your survival. They do not remember you, and yet you carry something forward that was shaped entirely by them. You pause once more, letting the moment settle. Then you move on steady and unhurried, leaving behind a night that no longer needs you. And now, as promised, you let the pace slow even further. The fire fades fully in your memory. The sounds soften. The air feels lighter. Your breathing lengthens without effort. Nothing asks for attention anymore. You are safe here, even as the image of the mountains drifts gently away. The cold becomes distant, like a story already told. The lessons remain, but they no longer press. You feel your shoulders sink, your jaw loosen, your thoughts stretch and blur at the edges. There is nothing left to plan, nothing left to watch. The night that once demanded everything now offers rest. You imagine the mountains settle into snow, holding still wind, moving gently around peaks, stars fading into daylight. Everything finds its place. Your body follows, easing into comfort, supported and calm. The world narrows to breath warmth and quiet. You did enough, you endured enough, now there is only rest. Let the last image soften, let it dim. Sleep arrives without effort, steady and kind. Sweet dreams.